Hannah Calloway read that letter once. Then she walked straight to the barn, saddled her horse, and rode 3 miles into the open pasture alone, not because she had somewhere to go, but because the walls of that house had suddenly stopped being big enough to hold what she was feeling. She had written to a placement bureau asking for 1 ranch hand. What stepped off that train was a tired cowboy, 4 hungry children, and the quiet, devastating possibility that fate had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her life or the most merciful one. She still didn't know which. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city name in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happened next on Silver Creek Ranch was something nobody, not Hannah, not Gideon, not even those 4 boys could have seen coming. She was not supposed to be at that station. That was the first thing Hannah Calloway told herself when she pulled up the wagon outside the Miles City Depot and set the brake and sat there for a full 10 seconds without climbing down. She was supposed to be at the north pasture, checking the fence line that had been losing her calves for 3 weeks running. She was supposed to be doing 15 other things that the Silver Creek Ranch needed done before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and Montana decided to finish what it had started. She was not supposed to be here, waiting on a train carrying a man she'd never met, extending a hand she wasn't sure she could afford to extend. Because 3 years of pride and grit and bleeding hands had finally bowed to the single undeniable arithmetic of winter coming and not enough men to face it. She climbed down anyway. She was a practical woman. She had asked for help. Help was arriving. That was the end of it. The depot smelled like coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular kind of cold that Miles City manufactured in October, the kind that didn't announce itself until it was already inside your coat. Hannah moved through it without stopping, scanning the room the way she scanned every room fast. Complete, efficient. The station master behind his counter, a woman knitting near the stove. A boy asleep on a bench, and then her gaze landed on a man standing near the far wall, hat in his hands, and she started across the room toward him and then stopped. Because behind the man was a boy of about 16, straight-backed and watchful. And beside that boy was another, younger, reading a book with the kind of focused concentration that meant he wasn't reading it at all. And near the stove was a third 10, maybe currently attempting to balance a walking stick across the bridge of his nose. And on the bench nearest the wall, curled up under a man's coat that was 3 sizes too big, was a child of maybe 6, fast asleep. Hannah Calloway stood in the middle of the Miles City Depot and counted to 4. Then she looked at the man. He was already looking at her. He had the look of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and has just realized the rehearsal was insufficient. Broad through the shoulders, weathered the way working men weather honestly, in the places that earn it. Eyes that were steady and tired in equal measure, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy for so long he's forgotten what it felt like to set it down. He took off his hat, he said. "You'd be Mrs. Calloway." "I would," she said, "and you'd be—" She stopped herself. She was counting again. She couldn't seem to stop counting. "Gideon Walker," he said. Then, quieter, stepping slightly forward so only she could hear. "I should tell you, ma'am. I didn't come alone." The depot noise continued around them, the station master's pencil, the knitting woman's needles, the distant whistle of a train not theirs. Hannah Calloway looked at Gideon Walker's 4 sons, one at a time, the way she looked at cattle she was considering purchasing. Not unkind, just honest. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked back at him. "Good," she said. "This ranch has been missing a family." Something moved through Gideon Walker's face, relief, she thought, and gratitude, and something else she couldn't name. He exhaled slowly, like a man who has been holding his breath across 3 states. He thought she meant one thing. She meant something else entirely. Neither of them knew it yet, and that particular misunderstanding was about to change both of their lives in ways that no placement bureau, however well-intentioned, could have engineered on purpose. My sons, Gideon said, turning Luke. The oldest straightened immediately, crossed to them, shook her hand without being told to, looked her directly in the eye. Owen. The reader appeared at his father's shoulder, solemn and assessing. Wyatt, the one with the stick, dropped it, grinned at her without apology. Benjamin. He moved to the bench and put a hand on the small shoulder, and the child stirred and blinked up at them both with the slow dignity of someone recently and reluctantly woken. Ben, come say hello. Ben slid off the bench. He stood in front of Hannah Calloway in his gitsk and looked up at her with dark, serious eyes. Then he said, "You got horses." "I do," Hannah said. "A lot?" "Enough." Ben considered this with the gravity of a man closing a business deal. "Okay," he said. And apparently that settled it for him, because he walked to her side and stood there, as though he'd always belonged there, which was, Hannah would later reflect, one of the most unnerving and unexpectedly moving things she'd ever witnessed. She drove them out to Silver Creek herself. She always drove herself, a fact that Gideon noticed. She could tell. In the small, precise way he noticed everything, filing it away without comment. The wagon bench seated 3 if nobody minded proximity. Ben installed himself between them without consultation. Wyatt's voice rose immediately from the wagon bed, narrating Montana with the confidence of someone who had been here before and simply forgotten he hadn't. "That mountain have a name?" The Pana said. "What's in them?" "Any bears, some." Wyatt processed this. "I think I want to go back to Kansas." "Wyatt," Luke's voice flat. "You're always just." Owen leaned forward from the wagon bed. "Is the winter here genuinely as severe as the agricultural reports suggest, Mrs. Calloway, or is that statistical exaggeration for insurance purposes?" Hannah blinked once. 13. "It's worse than the report," she said. Owen sat back, apparently satisfied. "I thought so." Ben had fallen asleep against her arm by the time the ranch came into view. She became aware of his weight incrementally, the way it increased, as he fully surrendered to sleep, the warmth of it through her coat sleeve. She did not move her arm. She told herself it was because waking him would cause disruption. She almost believed it. Silver Creek Ranch materialized out of the early evening dark, and she felt Gideon go still beside her, not tense, just alert, the way a man goes alert when he's looking at something through professional eyes. She watched him take in the east fence without pointing at it. Watched him register the barn door without commenting. Watched him catalog and file and say nothing at all, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind it. He wasn't inspecting her. He was understanding the place. There was a difference, and he clearly knew what it was. Her 3 hands came out when they heard the wagon. Jeb solid and unreadable at 50. Cal young and curious in a way he hadn't learned yet to disguise. Pete, who was 62 and had worked this land under 3 owners and regarded newcomers with the weary patience of a man who has outlasted opinions. They looked at Gideon with working man directness. They looked at the boys with frank surprise. Hannah climbed down and didn't give anyone time to settle into uncertainty. "Jeb, Cal, Pete, this is Gideon Walker. He's working alongside you starting tomorrow." She moved without pausing. "His boys are staying in the house. Jeb, bring that trunk." "Yes, ma'am, done," decided moving. She showed them the back room herself, 2 beds, a cot, a pallet she'd put together that afternoon, a hook on the door, a window that faced east and would give them the sunrise. Basic and clean and warm, which was what mattered. "It's not much," she said, standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Calloway." Gideon's voice stopped her. She looked back. He was looking at the room, at his sons already spreading out into it, Ben climbing the nearest bed, Wyatt opening the window to stick his head out, Owen running a finger along the book spines on the small shelf she hadn't thought to clear. "It's more than we've had in 8 months. He met her eyes. "Thank you." She nodded once. "Turn to go, Miss Hannah." She turned back. Ben was sitting upright on the bed, holding the edge of the blanket in both fists, looking at her with that same direct, dark-eyed gravity. "Yes, you got a dog?" Something shifted inside her ribcage, quietly, without warning. "Not anymore." "What was his name?" "Rufus." "Rufus," Ben repeated, tasting the word. Did he die? He did. Did it make you sad? Ben Gideon started. It's all right. She looked at the boy, a 6-year-old who asked honest questions and waited for honest answers, and the honesty of it was almost more than she knew what to do with. She said, "It made me very sad." Ben nodded slowly, satisfied. "I'll help you not be sad," he said. Then he lay back down and pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes with the finality of someone who has said the important thing and considers the matter resolved. Hannah Calloway stood in the doorway of that room and did not trust herself to speak. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at his son with an expression she recognized the way you recognize something you haven't seen in a long time, like walking into a room that smells like your childhood. Helpless love, the particular pain of it. He looked up and found her watching. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. She went downstairs and stood in her kitchen and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. Then she put the kettle on, because that was what you did. Gideon was in the kitchen before 4 in the morning. Hannah discovered this when she came downstairs at 4:30 to start the stove and found it already lit, the coffee already made, side pork already in the pan. And a man she'd known for approximately 6 hours standing at her stove in the dark like he'd done it 100 times. She stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. Coffee's on the table. Biscuits in about 10 minutes. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the mug. The kitchen was warm. She could not remember the last time she'd come downstairs to a warm kitchen. Daniel wasn't a cook, she said before she'd decided to say it. Your husband, 11 years. Never once. He turned then, looked at her. The firelight did what firelight does, soften the edges of things. She kept her face composed. She was very good at keeping her face composed. I'm sorry about your husband, he said. I'm sorry about your wife. A pause, real and mutual and without performance. Eleanor said. Fever 18 months ago. Daniel horsed through him. 3 years. He turned back to the stove. She drank her coffee. Outside, the dark was still total, Montana night pressing flat and heavy against the windows. The east fence, she said. I saw it. The northwest post is the problem. Not the wire. Freeze pressure on the base, he said. I figured. I'll reset it before the men are up. She looked at the back of his head. How did you know it was the post? Had the same problem on my place in Kansas. Spent 2 weeks chasing the wire before my father-in-law told me to look at the post base. A brief pause. Cost me 4 calves, cost me 3, won't cost you any more. She believed him. That was the strange part. She'd known this man less than a day, and she believed him. Not because he'd charmed her, not because he'd tried to. Because he spoke about the fence the way a man speaks about a thing he understands completely and intends to fix. And she had spent 3 years around men who spoke that way and meant it, and she knew the difference between that and performance. You ran cattle, she said. Shorethorns mostly. Herefords the last 2. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, just honest. Drought took the grass. Debt took the operation. Bank took the land. He flipped the pork. It happens to good ranchers. It does, she said. Because it did. Because she had been 3 months from that exact story herself 2 winters ago, before she'd sold the south acreage and bought herself another season. The biscuits came out right. She ate 2 without comment, which was, in her kitchen, the highest available form of praise. He seemed to understand that without being told. The boys came down in sequence, each one distinct as the last. Luke, already dressed and purposeful, quietly asked what needed doing before she'd offered anything. Owen appeared, swept the room with one comprehensive look, sat down, and said nothing, which was, Gideon told her later, Owen's version of being perfectly comfortable. Wyatt arrived at a run, skidded to a stop at the smell of biscuits, and said, Are those real biscuits? With the reverence of a man who has been surviving on something that was not real biscuits for longer than he cares to specify. And then Ben. Ben came down the stairs in stages, 1 step at a time, still in yesterday's shirt, hair standing in 4 directions, eyes mostly closed. He walked across the kitchen with the certainty of sleepwalking, and stopped directly beside Hannah's chair and stood there, swaying slightly. Hannah looked at him. He leaned against her arm. Just leaned against it, the way a small animal leans against a warm surface without calculation, without drama, as a simple matter of fact. She did not move. She did not breathe particularly steadily. She put her hand on the top of his head, very carefully, and he sighed the way children sigh when they are warm and almost asleep and have decided, at some instinctive animal level, that they are safe. Across the table she felt Gideon watching. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Quite. "Eat your breakfast, Ben," Gideon said quietly. "Me not hungry," Ben murmured. "You're always hungry." "Ma hungry later." He did not move from her side. She ate her breakfast with one hand. She did not say a word about it. Jeb came to find Gideon after sunup, out at the east fence where Gideon was already resetting the northwest post in the cold and steady way of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and doesn't need to be watched to do it. Jeb stood, said nothing for a while, then, "You done this kind of work before?" "Now and then. Mrs. Calloway said you'd be alongside us." "That's right, not above us." Gideon looked up. Jeb's face was weathered past readable, but his eyes were clear and direct. "Not above anyone," Gideon said. "I'm new here, you're not." Another silence. Then Jeb bent down and took the other end of the post without being asked, and held it steady while Gideon packed the base. They worked without speaking for 20 minutes, which was more than most conversations accomplished. "That post'll hold," Gideon said finally. "You sure?" "Watch it after the next north wind," Jeb grunted. "Then, the calves problem's been making us look stupid for 3 weeks. "Stupid," Gideon said. "It's a tricky problem." "You were looking at the wire. Should have looked at the post." "Now you know." Jeb looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Now we know. Luke worked beside his father all morning without saying much, which was how Luke worked. But at noon, eating standing up in the cold, he said, 'They like you.'" "Don't know that yet," Gideon said. Jeb held the post. "He doesn't help people he doesn't like." Gideon looked at his son. 16 years old and already reading rooms better than most grown men. He didn't know whether to be proud of that or sorry for it. "We need them to respect us," Gideon said. "That's different from being liked." "Can't it be both?" Gideon thought about Hannah Calloway at 4:30 in the morning, wrapping both hands around a coffee mug he'd made her, and not saying a single unnecessary word. "Maybe," he said, "if we earn it." Inside the house that afternoon, things happened that Gideon wasn't there for. Owen found the bookshelves in the back sitting room agricultural texts, Montana Territorial History, one volume of Tennyson with a cracked spine that had been read thoroughly. He stood in front of them for a long time. Then he found Hannah in the kitchen and said, with his most formal solemnity, "Mrs. Calloway, have these been read or are they for display?" Hannah turned from the stove and looked at him. "Everyone," she said. "Why, I'd like to borrow the Tennyson, if that's agreeable." She studied him. "Do you know Tennyson?" "Some. I know the Charge of the Light Brigade because my teacher made us memorize it. I know Ulysses because I read it myself, and I've been thinking about it since." She put down what she was holding. "What part?" Owen didn't hesitate. "The part at the end. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." He paused. "I think about that when things are hard." Hannah Calloway looked at this 13-year-old boy for a long moment. Then she crossed to the bookshelf and took down the Tennyson and handed it to him. "Keep it as long as you need," she said. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." Owen held the book in both hands and went to find somewhere quiet to read it, and Hannah stood in the sitting room afterward with an expression that no one saw, because she was alone. And it was a private thing, the expression of a woman who has been too long without someone to talk to who talks back. Wyatt found the barn in the first hour and did not come out until Jeb physically removed him for supper. He had in that time made the acquaintance of every horse individually, been bitten once by the bay mare, decided she was his favorite, discovered the cat with kittens behind the grain bins, named the black one Bandit and the gray one General on the grounds that it looked serious, and convinced Cal that he could fix the broken hinge on the tackroom door if someone would just give him the right tools. Cal gave him the tools, he fixed the hinge, Cal reported this to Jeb with an expression of mild bewilderment. Jeb said, which was Jeb's version of impressed. Dinner was the 6 of them at Hannah's long table. Her 3 hands ate in the bunkhouse, and it was louder than that table had been in 3 years. Wyatt knocked over his water glass and pretended it had happened to someone else. Owen asked Hannah 3 questions about Montana territorial water rights that she answered completely, and that Cal later said he hadn't known either. Ben ate steadily and thoroughly, and without comment, occasionally leaning against whoever was nearest, which was, more often than not, Hannah. She stopped noticing. She was doing it, moving her arm to accommodate him, shifting her chair a fraction of an inch in his direction. She only noticed when she caught Luke watching her do it, and then she straightened and said nothing, and he looked away and said nothing. And the moment passed like weather. After dinner, after the boys were upstairs, Hannah spread the ranch accounts across the kitchen table and walked Gideon through them without ceremony. Debt column, winter projection, feed costs, cattle weight, market price per head. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, plainly, completely, without softening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 6 questions. Each one went directly to the pressure point she'd been pressing against in the dark for 2 months. Each one was the right question. She stopped after the 3rd. Looked at him. "You're asking like a man who still owns land." "I'm asking," he said carefully, "like a man who wants to understand the problem well enough to help solve it." They looked at each other across that table. 2 people who had both run cattle, both buried a spouse, both spent years making impossible arithmetic work through stubbornness and refusal, and the sheer unwillingness to let the land win. Something in the room was very quiet and very alert. "The south pasture rotation," he said. "You're burning it too early." "I know. If you hold the south herd back until mid-November, I lose 2 weeks of weight gain. You gain a full winter's worth of ground cover. The weight comes back in spring faster than you think." She looked at him. He looked at her. "My father-in-law's method," he said. "Saved his operation in '79. It's a risk. Winter's already a risk. This one you control." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back at the accounts. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. That was enough. He didn't push. She noted that he didn't push. She walked upstairs 30 minutes later and stopped at the door of the back room. She could hear breathing, the even, layered breathing of 4 people genuinely asleep. She stood in the hall for a moment. Then she went to her room and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a 6-year-old boy leaning against her arm like she was a wall he'd always known was there. She thought about it for a long time. 2 weeks became 3. 3 weeks became a month. The ranch changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a room changes when someone opens a window. Degree by degree. The east fence held through 2 north winds, and Cal told Pete, and Pete told Jeb, and Jeb said nothing to anyone, but showed up the next morning at the fence line with Gideon, without being asked, to start on the section heading south. Luke was moving cattle with the hands by the end of the 1st week, and by the 2nd week, Jeb was checking his opinion on things the same way he checked Pete's, which was the highest currency Jeb dispensed. Owen was quietly reading everything in the back room, and occasionally saying things that made Hannah stop what she was doing and argue back, which she found, to her own astonishment, that she liked the arguing back, the being answered, the not being agreed with, simply because she owned the property. Wyatt fixed 3 more things in the first 2 weeks without being specifically asked to fix them, and won over Pete entirely by asking, with complete genuine interest. About every piece of equipment Pete had strong opinions about, and Pete had strong opinions about all of them. And Ben was simply everywhere Hannah was, not underfoot. Not demanding. Just present, in the particular way of a small animal that has decided on its person and intends to remain in proximity to them as a matter of personal principle. He followed her to the morning rounds. He sat beside her at meals. He fell asleep against her arm with a regularity and a completeness that suggested he had never in his life doubted his welcome, which Hannah understood, on some level she didn't examine closely, was exactly the point. She had caught herself, once, In the third week, watching him sleep in a chair by the kitchen stove, and thinking, he stopped having nightmares. She didn't know how she knew that. She just knew. The way you know when a sound that's been there so long you forgot it was there finally stops. She put the thought away and went back to work. Gideon, meanwhile, had stopped asking himself what this was. He told himself that was wisdom. He told himself he was being practical. He was here to work. She had hired help. That was the shape of this thing. He woke at 4 and made coffee and fixed what needed fixing and fell asleep at night, running through cattle rotations and feed calculations, and the particular satisfaction of a problem solved. He did not think about the way she looked at Ben's drawings the boy had started drawing, crayon pictures of horses and dogs, and what appeared to be a large cat that he insisted was Rufus, and he left them on the kitchen table. And Hannah always moved them to the windowsill before she cleaned the table, carefully, without saying a word. He didn't think about that. He didn't think about the morning he'd come in from the fence and found her in the kitchen, reading Owen's Tennyson aloud to herself, very quietly, standing at the counter with a mug going cold beside her. She'd heard him come in, stopped, and neither of them had mentioned it. He told himself he wasn't thinking about these things. He almost believed it, and then on a Tuesday in the fourth week, Cal rode in from town with the weekly mail. Hannah was at the kitchen table going over October's accounts when he came in and put it on the counter. A few circulars, a bill from the billing supplier, and a letter, crisp and official, from the Territorial Placement Bureau. She opened it last. She read it once, quickly. Then she went still. She read it again. The Bureau was writing to apologize. A clerical error had been discovered, a misfiling between their billings office and their Kansas City branch. They wanted to confirm that she understood Mr. Gideon Walker had responded to a file that described a widow seeking companionship and a new family, not to a request for ranch employment. They hoped this had not caused any inconvenience. Hannah set the letter on the table. Outside, she could hear Wyatt arguing cheerfully with the bay mare. She could hear the ring of Gideon's hammer on the loading chute steady, measured, unhurried, the sound of a man who does things right. She could hear the creak of Owen's floorboard overhead, the one he always hit when he was pacing. And from the kitchen doorway, she could see Ben's drawings lined up on the windowsill, where she'd put them. 6 of them now, each one a little better than the last. She sat very still. He had come here believing he was bringing his children to a woman who wanted a family. He had read a letter, and he had needed it to be true. She could see that. Looking back, she could see exactly how much he had needed it to be true, and he had packed up 4 children and the last of his money and ridden 3 states to make it so. And she had hired a ranch hand, and what had arrived was a man who reset fence posts before sunrise and made coffee she didn't have to ask for, and asked the right questions and fixed the loading chute nobody had gotten to in 4 months. And 4 boys who had walked into her empty too-quiet house and simply filled it. Without trying, without drama, the way water fills a vessel. Because that is what water does. She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She pressed her hand flat against it, through the wool, feeling the crinkle of the paper. Then she stood up, and she walked to the kitchen window, and she stood there looking out at the yard, at the fence line that held now, at the barn that had a functioning tack room door, at the cat sitting in the sun outside the barn entrance, at Gideon Walker's back as he worked on the loading chute with the patience and precision of a man who builds things to last, and she breathed. Slowly, carefully, she had one decision to make. She knew that. Just one, and it was not a small one, and she needed to make it before she said a single word to him. Did she tell him the truth and give him the choice she hadn't known she was taking from him? Or did she hold the letter and hold her silence and hold everything just exactly as it was, which was, if she was completely finally, devastatingly honest with herself, the closest thing to alive that Silver Creek Ranch had felt since the morning they put Daniel Calloway in the ground? She stood at that window a long time. Outside, Ben came running across the yard toward Gideon, both arms windmilling, shouting something about Bandit the cat. Gideon caught him without stopping work, swung him up onto the fence rail beside him, and kept hammering. Ben grabbed Gideon's sleeve with one hand and pointed at the cat with the other, and talked without stopping, and Gideon listened and worked, and nodded and said something that made Ben laugh so hard he nearly fell off the rail. Gideon caught him again, set him straight, kept working. Hannah watched that and felt the letter in her pocket and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she was already too late to make this simple. She had already made her decision. She just wasn't ready yet to know what it was. She didn't tell him. That was the decision she made, standing at the kitchen window with the letter folded in her coat pocket, and Ben's laughter still cutting clean and bright through the cold yard air. She pressed her hand flat against the paper one more time. Then she walked away from the window, put the kettle on, and started supper like nothing had happened, because that was what you did when the ground shifted under you, and you weren't ready to fall. She was a practical woman. She would figure this out. She always figured things out. What she had not accounted for was how much harder it is to figure something out when every single morning begins with a man who has already made coffee before you came downstairs. Gideon was at the stove at 4 every morning without fail. She'd tested it once, came down at 3:45 just to see, and he was already there, moving around her kitchen in the dark, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned not to take up more space than he needs. He'd heard her on the stairs and turned and said, 3:45, with no particular inflection, and she'd said, I couldn't sleep, and he'd poured her coffee without asking and gone back to the biscuits. And they'd sat at that table in the dark and not said much of anything, and it was the most comfortable 30 minutes she'd had in 3 years. That was the problem, if she was being honest about it. All of it was too comfortable. All of it had arrived too easily, too naturally, the way a broken bone sometimes knits so clean that you can't find the line where it broke. She was finding it harder every day to find the line. The Monday after the letter arrived, she rode out to the south pasture to check the cattle. She'd actually decided, she'd lain awake and run the numbers, and decided to hold back until mid-November. Gideon's suggestion, her decision, that distinction mattered to her. She was still working out exactly why. She was counting heads in the south herd when she heard a horse behind her and turned and found Luke Walker pulling up 10 feet away on the roan gelding, looking slightly uncertain about whether he'd been invited. Your father send you? She asked. No, ma'am. He dismounted without hurrying. I came on my own. Thought you might need another pair of eyes on the count. She looked at him for a moment. 16 years old, and he sat a horse like he'd been born on one. He had Gideon's eyes, that same steady, measuring quality, but something else in the set of his jaw that she thought might be his mother. You know how to count cattle? She asked. My father had 200 head before the drought. That's not what I asked. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. I know how to count cattle. They worked the south herd together without speaking much, which was how Hannah preferred to work, and which Luke seemed to understand without being told. He was good, efficient, quiet, attentive. He caught a heifer with a tender foreleg that Hannah hadn't noticed, and he caught it by watching the animal's gait from 30 yards, which was the kind of observation you couldn't teach. She'll need to come in, Hannah said when she looked. Yes, ma'am, before it gets worse. You've done this before. Helped my father. He paused. I used to follow him around the pastures before I was big enough to be useful. Just to learn. Another pause shorter. He's the best rancher I know. He said it without emphasis, not to persuade her, just as a fact he was putting on the table. Hannah looked at the tender-legged heifer. I know, she said. Luke was quiet for a moment. He doesn't say much. About all of this, he gestured, meaning everything. The ranch, the situation, the letter that he didn't know existed. But he's happy here, I can tell. He looked at her directly the way his father looked at her, that same quality of honest, inconvenient attention. He hasn't been happy in a long time, Mrs. Calloway. Hannah kept her eyes on the herd. Get that heifer separated. We'll take her back before it rains. Yes, ma'am. Luke said, and if he knew she'd deflected, he didn't say so. He went to work, and she watched him go, and the letter in her coat pocket felt heavier than it had that morning. She hadn't taken it out of her coat. She'd moved it from the riding coat to the everyday coat, to the heavy wool coat she wore in the evenings, folded small and pressed into the inside pocket, where it sat against her ribs like a coal that hadn't quite gone cold. She told herself she was keeping it there to remind herself to deal with it. She was beginning to suspect that wasn't the whole truth. Wednesday brought the first serious cold front of the season, the kind that moves in from the north in the night and makes the whole world smaller and harder by morning. Hannah found ice in the water troughs at 5:30, and by 6 she had Jeb and Cal breaking it, and Gideon already out at the south pasture windbreak, shoring up the gap since the brush line that she'd been meaning to address since September. She rode out to check his progress and found him working alongside Pete, the two of them moving with the steady synchronized efficiency of men who have figured out how the other one moves. Pete was 62 and generally required a geological epoch to warm to anyone new, and here he was, handing Gideon brush sections and grunting in what was, for Pete, animated conversation. Hannah pulled up and watched for a moment. Gideon looked up. "Windbreak'll hold," he said. "South herd's going to want moving by tomorrow if this front keeps coming." "I know." She paused. "How did you know about the south herd timing?" "Luke told me what you'd decided, about holding them. He kept working." "Smart call. Your instincts on this land are good." She looked at him. He was not flattering her. He was stating an assessment the same way he assessed the fence post and the loading chute directly, without ornament. "Your idea," she said. "My suggestion, he your land." "Your decision." He looked up again, and for just a moment she had the feeling he was saying something else entirely, something that ran under the surface of the actual words like a current under ice. "Always will be." She held his gaze for 1 second too long. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward the barn, and she told herself the cold front was why her face felt warm. Inside the house, Owen had apparently spent the morning compiling what he called when Wyatt asked, with genuine curiosity and operational assessment. "A what?" Wyatt said. "I've been looking at the feed accounts and the cattle weight records and the winter pasture schedule," Owen said, in the patient tone of a boy who has explained things to Wyatt his entire life and will continue to do so without hope of the gap closing. "There are some inefficiencies. You've been in the house for 3 hours." I read fast, stared at him. "You're 13. "I'm aware of that." Hannah found Owen's notes on the kitchen table when she came in for the midday break, 3 pages, neat and small-handed, with observations and questions in the margins. She picked them up. She read them, all 3 pages. Then she sat down at the table and read them again. He was right about 2 of the inefficiencies. The third one, she could explain it, was a quirk of how her late husband had set up the accounts, that she'd never changed, because changing it would mean sitting with those books for a full afternoon, and she hadn't been able to make herself do it. But Owen was right that it looked wrong from the outside. She found him in the sitting room with another book and said, without preamble, the third item. On page 2, the quarterly account split. Owen looked up immediately. "I didn't understand why it was structured that way." "My husband set it up. I haven't changed it." Owen held her gaze. He had the peculiar quality of seeming much older when he was thinking, not in a troubling way, just in the way of a person whose interior life runs deeper than the surface suggests. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the reflexive sorry that people offered about Daniel. Something more specific, more careful. Is it hard, keeping things the way he had them? She looked at this 13-year-old boy who had just asked the most perceptive question anyone had asked her in 3 years. "Sometimes," she said. He nodded. "My father kept my mother's coffee cup on the shelf for 6 months," he said. "He never used it. He just didn't move it." He looked at his book. "I think it was the same." Hannah sat down in the chair across from him. "Owen." "Yes, ma'am, your notes. The first 2 inefficiencies." "You're right about both of them." She paused. "Where did you learn to read accounts?" He looked almost pleased, which for Owen was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "My father taught me." He said a rancher who can't read his own books is working for the bank without knowing it. A very small pause. He said that's what happened to us. He caught it too late. The room was quiet for a moment. He caught it too late because your mother was sick, Hannah said. It wasn't. Looked at her. Yes, he said. He was watching her, not the books. That's not a failure, Hannah said. That's a husband. Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I know. I just think he doesn't. She left Owen in the sitting room and went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and thought about a man who had run a cattle operation for 11 years, taught his 13-year-old to read accounts, watched his wife die, lost his land, packed 4 children onto a train, and ridden 3 states on the strength of a letter from a placement bureau because he needed it to be true. Because a man will travel any distance for the thing his family needs if he can just find the direction to go. She took the letter out of her coat pocket. She looked at it. She put it back. Not yet, she told herself. She needed to be sure first of what she was going to say when she told him. She needed to be sure of what she wanted. The problem was that she was becoming increasingly, uncomfortably sure. Thursday evening, she came in from the evening rounds to find the kitchen full of a smell so specific and so completely unexpected that she stopped inside the doorway and stood there, hands still on the latch, while her mind tried to place it. Gideon was at the stove. On the counter beside him were 3 apple peelings and a small pile of cinnamon from the spice shelf and the cast-iron Dutch oven she hadn't used in over a year because it had been Eleanor's recipe and she hadn't been able to bring herself to look at it. Apple cake, Wyatt announced from the table, where he was technically doing the arithmetic homework that Hannah had assigned him 2 days ago, but was mostly watching the stove. Pa makes it for birthdays. Hannah looked at the Dutch oven. Whose birthday? Nobody's, Wyatt frowned. Said sometimes you don't need a reason. She looked at Gideon's back. He turned around then, and he looked at her, and she realized he'd known she was standing in the doorway the whole time. I found the Dutch oven in the back of the cabinet, he said. Hope that's all right. It's fine, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. It's just a pot. She set the table herself, something she hadn't done in 3 weeks, because one of the boys always beat her to it, and she moved around that kitchen with careful efficiency, and she didn't once look at the Dutch oven again. And if Gideon noticed any of that, he said nothing, and she was grateful. The cake came out just before supper. It wasn't fancy a working rancher's cake, simple and dense and exactly right. The way that everything Gideon Walker produced tended to be exactly right without appearing to try. Ben ate 2 pieces and fell asleep at the table. Luke carried him up without waking him, and came back down and finished his own piece standing up, and nobody thought anything of it, because this had become just what they did. How they moved in this house. The weight of it settled over Hannah as she watched it happen. How completely and quietly and without any announcement at all this had become how they moved. You all right? Wyatt asked her. He was licking frosting off his thumb and watching her with the particular alert attention that appeared beneath his noise sometimes, the glint of the same perceptiveness his brother carried, just differently packaged. Fine, she said. You've got a look. What kind of look? Wyatt considered. Like when Pa's thinking hard about something but not saying what it is. The table went slightly quiet. Owen looked up from his book. Luke, coming back downstairs, paused on the bottom step. Gideon, at the far end of the table, looked at her steadily. He said nothing. He just looked. And in that look was the clear and composed and entirely patient acknowledgement that he knew she had something she wasn't saying, and that he was prepared to wait. I'm thinking about the Southherd rotation, Hannah said. It was not a lie, it was just not the truth. Wyatt appeared completely satisfied by this. Owen went back to his book. Luke sat down. The table noise resumed. Gideon picked up his coffee and kept looking at her for 1 moment longer. Then he looked away and she breathed again. Friday brought the first real incident. It came from outside the ranch, which was, Hannah had learned, where most real incidents came from. Frank Aldridge rode in mid-morning on his gray quarter horse, and Hannah saw him coming from the barn and felt the particular flattening of her mood that Aldridge reliably produced in her. He was a cattle broker from Miles City, mid-40s, the kind of man who spoke pleasantly and negotiated ruthlessly and always made you feel, afterward, that the conversation had somehow moved several inches to the left of where you'd intended it to be. He was also one of 2 men who had offered to buy Silver Creek Ranch in the past 3 years, and he had not given up hoping she'd eventually run out of reasons to say no. "Hannah," he said, climbing down, already smiling. "Cold morning. You're looking well, Frank," she said. "What brings you out?" Not a question. She didn't want it to be a question. "Heard you'd taken on some help." He looked around the yard with the proprietary interest of a man who has assessed this property more than once. "Ranch hand out of Kansas, that right? And some family?" "A ranch hand," she said. "Yes. 4 children, word has it." He smiled pleasantly. "Quite a commitment for a working operation." "They're earning their keep," she said. "I'm sure they are." He was still smiling. "Word in town is the Walker man's taken quite an interest in how things are run out here. Riding out with your hands, talking rotations, that kind of thing." Hannah looked at him steadily. "He's experienced." "I asked for experienced." "Of course." He tilted his head. "Although, and I'm only saying this as someone who has your best interests genuinely at heart, Hannah, there is such a thing as letting someone get too comfortable on land they don't have a stake in. Particularly a man in his situation. No land of his own. 4 children to feed." The smile stayed warm and never reached his eyes. Men in that position can develop expectations that a woman running a solo operation isn't always equipped to manage. Silence. Hannah felt something harden behind her sternum that had nothing to do with the cold. "Frank," she said very quietly, "I've been running this operation for 3 years. Without help and without suggestions. I think I know how to manage my own land and my own arrangements." She held his gaze. "Was there something specific you needed, or did you ride out here to give me advice?" Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed easy, unconcerned, the laugh of a man who thinks he's simply waiting for the right moment. "Just being neighborly. I'll be in town through the weekend if you want to talk." "About anything. I'll keep that in mind," she said. He rode out. She watched him go with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and the very clear understanding that the town had been talking about Gideon Walker's presence at Silver Creek Ranch, and that Frank Aldridge was going to use every word of it that he could find a use for. She was still standing there when Gideon came around the corner of the barn. He looked at the retreating horse, then at her face. "Trouble?" "Frank Aldridge," she said, "cattle broker. He's had his eye on this land for 3 years." Gideon watched the gray quarter horse disappear past the fence line. "What did he want?" "To suggest that I might be losing control of my own operation." She said it flat and without heat, the way you state a fact you find contemptible. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and in nothing. He wanted to plant the thought and let it grow. She looked at Gideon. "He mentioned you by name." Gideon met her gaze. "He trying to tell you I'm overstepping?" "He's trying to make me worry about it." "Are you?" She considered that honestly, which was more than the question probably deserved. "No," she said, "but I'm telling you so you know, there will be more of it. Talk in town. You being here with the boys, the 2 of us, it'll generate talk." "It already is. Does that bother you?" She looked at him directly. "I care about this ranch. I don't care much about what people say about it." "All right," he said. Simple, uncomplicated. Not pressing, not performing, just all right. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her chest shifted without her permission, and she turned and went back inside before it could shift any further. That night she took the letter out of her coat pocket and sat at the kitchen table alone after everyone was in bed and read it again, for the 4th time, like it might have changed since she last looked at it. It hadn't. The Bureau's careful, apologetic language was exactly where it had always been. She put the letter on the table, smoothed it flat with the edge of her hand. Sat with it. He had come here for a family. He had read a letter and needed it to be true and ridden 3 states for it. That was the truth. That was what the Bureau had confirmed. And she had known it for 5 days now and hadn't said a word. The question she'd been avoiding, the one that sat beneath all the practical thinking and all the deliberate busyness, was this. Was she keeping quiet because she was still deciding what to say? Or was she keeping quiet because some part of her, the part that had watched Ben sleep soundly for the first time in God knew how long, the part that had argued about Tennyson with a 13-year-old and liked it, the part that had eaten 2 pieces of apple cake and let herself, for 30 minutes, not be a woman who was surviving, was keeping quiet because she didn't want it to stop. She sat with that question for a long time. The fire burned down. She folded the letter back up, put it back in her pocket, and went to bed. She did not sleep well. Saturday morning broke clear and bitterly cold. Gideon had the coffee ready. She sat down and didn't say much, and he didn't push, and they sat in that particular comfortable silence that had become the shape of their mornings, and she hated just a little, just at the edges, how much she had come to rely on it. Ben came down early, which was unusual. He was dressed, but his boots were on the wrong feet, which she noticed when he came to stand beside her chair in his customary position. She looked down at his feet without a word, and he looked down at his feet, and she reached down and fixed them unlaced, swapped, relaced in the efficient and unremarkable way you fix something that needs fixing. And he stood perfectly still while she did it, and when she straightened up he said, "Thank you, Miss Hannah," with a solemnity so complete it almost broke something in her, and went to get his breakfast. Gideon was looking at his coffee. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were going to—" He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say thank you." She didn't answer that. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The morning continued. But something had cracked. Just a fraction. Just enough for air to get through. And they both knew it. And neither one of them said so. The afternoon took a turn nobody had anticipated. Wyatt came into the kitchen at 2 o'clock at a dead run, which was how Wyatt moved when something was actually wrong, versus when something was interesting, and Hannah had already learned the difference. She was on her feet before he got the words out. "It's Ben," he said. He was following the gray cat up by the north fence, and he went through the top rail, and he's stuck in the creek bank. "He's not hurt," he added immediately, reading her face, "but he's stuck and it's cold and he won't stop crying." She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. Gideon was a half-second behind her, and she didn't wait for either of them. She went out at a pace that wasn't quite a run but covered ground faster than most people's running, and she could hear Gideon behind her, and she didn't slow down. She found Ben wedged between the broken fence rail and the frozen creek bank, up to his waist in frozen mud, both hands gripping the fence post above him. Crying with the specific exhausted quality of a child who has been crying long enough that the fear has become more about the cold than the stuck. His face was red and his hands were white and he was shaking. She was in the mud beside him in 3 seconds. "Benjamin, look at me." She got her hands under his arms. "I've got you. Look at me." He turned his face to her, tear-streaked and miserable. "I was following General," he said, meaning the gray cat. "He went under the fence and I went after him. I know." "I've got you. Stop fighting it. You'll go deeper. Stay still." He went still. She could feel Gideon behind her, and then Gideon's hands were bracing her against the slope, steady and sure. And she got Ben up out of the mud in 2 hard pulls and caught him against her chest, and he locked his arms around her neck and buried his face there and shook. She held him. She didn't say anything. She just held him, standing in the frozen mud by the broken fence rail with Gideon's hand at her back and this small frozen shaking child pressed against her shoulder, and she held on. "I've got you," she said again, quieter this time. For him or for herself, she wasn't entirely certain. Gideon said nothing. He just stood where he was, keeping her steady, until she was ready to move. She carried Ben back to the house. He was too heavy for it. Realistically 6 years old and solid, and both of them mud-covered and half-frozen, but she carried him anyway. Gideon walked beside her. Neither of them said a word the whole way back. She got him inside and sat him on the kitchen floor and got his boots off and his coat off and wrapped him in the wool blanket from the sitting room chair and sat down on the floor with him. The floor. Hannah Calloway, who did not sit on floors, sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and this muddy 6-year-old in her lap and her arms around him. and she rocked him the same way you rock something precious that you thought for one terrible second you might have lost. Gideon came in, he put the kettle on. He didn't say a word. Owen appeared in the doorway, took one look, went away. Came back 2 minutes later with the other blanket from upstairs, draped it over both of them without comment, and went away again. Wyatt appeared behind Owen, looked at the scene, and for once in his living life did not say a single word. He just went to the stove and stood beside Gideon and watched the kettle and was quiet. Luke came in last. He stood in the doorway and looked at his father, and his father looked at him, and something passed between them that was old and private, and not for anyone else. Then Luke looked at Hannah on the floor with Ben in her arms, and his face did something complicated and young and real, and he went to the table and sat down. Gideon brought her tea. He crouched down and held it out, and she took it without letting go of Ben, and their fingers touched on the mug for just a second, just an instant. Not planned, not performed. Just the unavoidable physics of passing something between two people in a small space, and she did not look up. Ben had stopped shaking. He was breathing steadily now, the slow deepening of a child going under into warmth and sleep. "He's all right," Gideon said. Very quietly, I know, she said. Just as quiet. She looked up then. She couldn't have said why she chose that moment. But she looked up, and he was right there close. Crouched, looking at her with that steady, tired, honest attention, and the kitchen was warm, and the kettle was quiet, and Ben's weight was solid in her arms. And she thought, I am not going to be able to keep this at a distance. I have been trying for a month, and I am not going to be able to do it. I don't want to do it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. Then Ben shifted in her arms and murmured something that sounded like general, and she looked down, and the moment moved through and past them like water, and Gideon stood up and went back to the stove. And she sat on the floor and held Ben and breathed, and told herself she still had time. She had the letter. She needed to tell him. She would tell him. She would. But Ben was warm and asleep in her arms, and the kitchen smelled like tea and wood smoke, and the residue of apple cake from 2 days ago, and outside the north wind was picking up, and she was not going to move from this floor yet. She stayed until he was fully asleep. Then she carried him up to his bed, and she tucked him in, and she stood at the door of that room, looking at him in the way she'd stood at the door that first night and counted the breathing. Except now she wasn't counting, she was just looking. She went downstairs and put on her coat, and the letter was in the pocket where it always was, and she thought about taking it out and going to find Gideon and saying, I need to tell you something. I should have told you a week ago. I'm going to tell you now. She thought about it all the way to the barn. Then she found Gideon already there, checking the horses, and Luke beside him, and she heard Luke's voice before she could announce herself low and serious, the way Luke sounded when he was saying something true. She loves him, Pa, Luke said. She might not know it yet. But she does. Silence. She went perfectly still in the barn doorway. Gideon didn't answer immediately. She heard him move the sound of a brush against a horse's flank, slow and steady. Then Luke, I'm just saying what I see. I know what you're saying. Are you going to do something about it? Another pause. Longer. I don't know yet what there is to do, Gideon said. This isn't I came here on a misunderstanding. You know that. Her breath stopped, he knew, or he suspected, or he had started to suspect. Something had told him, something in the shape of the arrangement, that didn't quite fit what he'd expected, and he was sitting with it. Wait, she was sitting with it, not saying it, not pressing it, waiting to understand what it meant before he spoke. Luke said, Does it matter how you got here? Gideon was quiet for a long time. It matters to her, he said finally. Whatever this is, it has to be her choice. All of it, every part of it, a breath. I won't be something that happened to her. I won't be another thing she didn't get to decide. Hannah stood in the barn doorway in the cold dark and felt something break open in her chest that was not painful and not peaceful, but something unresolvable between the two. Something that had been pressing from the inside for 4 weeks and had finally found a way through. She backed away from the doorway before either of them could turn and find her there. She walked back to the house. She went upstairs and checked on Ben, who was sleeping without a sound. Then she went to her room and took the letter out of her pocket and set it on her bedside table and looked at it for a long time. And thought about a man who had come 3 states on a wrong letter and was standing in her barn at this very moment and saying, "I won't be something that happened to her." She thought about what kind of man says that. She thought about it for a long time. Outside, the north wind moved through the Montana dark, and Silver Creek Ranch held against it the way it always held, steadily, stubbornly, with everything it had. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Hannah Calloway did not feel like she was holding it alone. She told him on a Sunday. She hadn't planned it for Sunday. She hadn't planned it for any particular day. She'd been telling herself for a week that she was waiting for the right moment, which was what people said when they were afraid of the moment they already had. But Sunday came in quiet and gray, with a light snow that wasn't committing to anything, and Gideon was at the kitchen table, doing the feed calculation she'd asked him to look at. And the boys were occupied, Ben drawing at the other end of the table, Owen reading, Wyatt somewhere in the barn doing God knew what. Luke out with Jeb checking the south herd, and Hannah came downstairs with the letter in her hand and stood at the bottom of the stairs for 10 seconds. Then she walked to the table and set it down in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. He didn't touch it. "From the bureau," she said. "It came 8 days ago." He was very still. 8 days. I needed to figure out what I was going to say. He looked at the letter again. Still didn't touch it. "Did you figure it out?" "No," she said. "But I've been carrying it for 8 days, and that's long enough." Ben looked up from his drawing, looked at his father's face, looked at Hannah's. Then he went back to drawing with the focused discretion of a child who understands more than adults assume. Gideon picked up the letter. He read it the way she'd read it, that first time, quickly, the way you read something your brain has already started understanding before your eyes finish. Then he set it flat on the table, smoothed it with one hand. Looked at it. "There was a mistake," he said. "Yes. I didn't come here for work." He said it as a statement, not an accusation. Just a man placing a fact on the table between them, cleanly, where both of them could see it. "I know," Hannah said. "And you hired a ranch hand." "I know that too." The kitchen was very quiet. The snow outside was still not committing. Ben's crayon moved steadily on his paper. Hannah. He hadn't called her by her name before. Not once in the 5 weeks he'd been here. It was always Mrs. Calloway, respectful, appropriate, the correct distance. Her name in his voice landed differently than she'd expected. "What do you want to do?" She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. "I want to know what you thought when you read that bureau letter. Back in Kansas, what you actually thought." He looked at her steadily. He wasn't going to make this easy by deflecting, and she knew it before she asked. "I thought God had finally answered something I'd been asking for a long time," he said. "I thought my boys were going to be all right." He paused. "I thought I let myself think that maybe I was going to be all right too." The words came out even and honest, and without any attempt to move her with them, which was precisely why they moved her. "And now," she said, he was quiet for a moment, "now I know I came here on a wrong letter. And I know that whatever's happened in 5 weeks, it started on a misunderstanding. And I know he started again. I know that this has to be your choice. Every part of it, because this is your land and your life, and I will not be something that happened to you without your say." Ben's crayon stopped. He was looking at his father with dark, serious eyes that were completely unsurprised, which meant he had understood the shape of this conversation 5 minutes ago. "Pa, now, Ben." "But Pa, Benjamin." Ben pressed his lips together, looked at Hannah, looked at his drawing, put the crayon down very deliberately and folded his hands on the table and sat in an attitude of pointed and conspicuous patience. Hannah looked at this 6-year-old and felt something crack open in her chest for the second time in a week. Then she looked at Gideon. "I have something to say," she said. "And I need you to let me say it without interrupting." "All right, I hired a ranch hand. That's what I wrote to that bureau for." One man, experienced, who could help me get through a winter that was going to beat me if I faced it alone. She kept her eyes on his. What arrived was you and 4 boys, and for about 30 seconds in that train station, I genuinely thought that my entire life was about to go sideways in a way I could not afford. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. His face was composed and attentive and gave nothing away. And then Ben asked me if I had horses, she said. And something happened that I wasn't, she stopped. Took a breath. I have not let anything matter to me the way this ranch matters. Not since Daniel. I didn't want anything to matter like that again. Because when it does and you lose it, the losing is. She stopped again. I know what the losing is, Gideon said very quietly. I know you do. She looked at the letter on the table between them. I've been carrying this for 8 days, because once I told you the truth, I had to figure out what I wanted. And I don't do things without figuring them out first. That's just who I am. I know who you are, he said. Still quiet, still steady. Then you know that I'm telling you this now because I've figured it out. She looked at him directly. I don't want you to leave. I'm not asking you to stay the way you thought you were staying. I'm not ready for I can't promise you, she breathed. But I don't want you to leave. And that's the most honest thing I've said to anyone in 3 years. The kitchen held that for a moment. Gideon looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she started to brace herself for something she didn't want to hear. And then he said, I can work with honest. Ben's head came up immediately. Does that mean we're staying? Ben, because I told Bandit we were staying, and I don't want to have told him wrong. Hannah looked at this boy. She pressed her mouth together. It didn't help. Something that was almost a laugh found its way out of her anyway, and she pressed her hand over it, and Gideon's face shifted just barely. Just at the edges into something that was the warmest thing she'd seen on a human face in a very long time. We're staying, Gideon said. He was looking at Hannah when he said it. Not at Ben. Ben picked up his crayon and went back to his drawing with the decisive tranquility of a matter resolved. That should have been the end of the hard part. It wasn't. The letter to the Bureau was one thing. Frank Aldridge was another. And what Hannah had not fully accounted for was that a woman running a ranch alone in 1,887 Miles City, Montana, who suddenly had an unmarried man and 4 children living in her house, was going to generate the kind of talk that didn't stay talk for long. It started the following Wednesday. She rode into town for supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, the usual, and she felt it before she could name it. The way Mrs. Hargrove at the dry goods counter was a half-degree too careful with her pleasantries. The way 2 women outside the post office found something to look at across the street when she passed. The way Tom Petty at the feed store made a joke that landed nowhere and knew it, and kept talking to cover it. She did her business and rode home and didn't say a word about it. Thursday morning, Gideon came in from town. He'd gone with Luke to pick up fencing wire, and she watched his face when he came through the door and knew that he'd felt it too. Leave it, she said before he could speak. He looked at her. Hannah, I said, leave it, it's talk. Talk doesn't fix fences. He was quiet for a moment. Cal heard something at the feed store. I said, leave it, Gideon. He left it. But his jaw had a set to it that she recognized, because she'd seen it in the mirror, and she knew he wasn't leaving it inside his own head, just in the conversation between them, which was probably the wisest division of labor available. What she didn't know, what she found out 2 days later, from Jeb, delivered in Jeb's characteristic style of maximum information in minimum words, was that Frank Aldridge had been in town all week. That he had been at the hotel bar on Tuesday evening when a man from the land assessor's office had been there. That he had mentioned, in what was probably a carefully casual way, that he had concerns about the arrangements out at the Callaway Ranch. That he'd used the word irregular. Jeb delivered this information standing in the barn doorway, looking at a point approximately 4 inches above Hannah's left shoulder, in the tone of a man discharging a duty he'd rather not have. Irregular, Hannah said. Yes, ma'am, he used that word specifically. Cal heard him. Cal's got good ears. Hannah stood with this for a moment. She knew what Aldridge was doing. He wasn't going to come at her directly. He'd learned 3 years ago that coming at her directly produced results he didn't want. He was going to make the situation uncomfortable enough and the talk loud enough that she'd start to feel the pressure from all sides at once. He was going to use the letter and the children and the fact of an unmarried man in her house to build a story that made Silver Creek Ranch look unstable, and an unstable ranch was a ranch that needed rescuing. And Aldridge had been waiting 3 years to be the one who did the rescuing. "All right," she said. "You want me to say something to him?" "No," she said. "I want you to say nothing and let me think." She was still thinking when Owen appeared at her elbow approximately 40 minutes later. He had a look on his face that she had learned to pay attention to the specific look he wore when he had assembled a set of facts and was deciding how to present them. "I heard what Jeb said," Owen told her. "He did not apologize for listening." "Owen never apologized for listening." "Of course you did. This Aldridge man, he wants the ranch. He wants to buy it." "Yes, he can't make you sell. He can make it difficult not to." Owen thought about this, how she looked at him. She had a policy, she'd discovered, of answering Owen honestly. Partly because he deserved it, and partly because he would find out anyway. He can talk to the land assessor. He can question whether the operation is being run properly, whether there are concerns about the management. She paused. "He can use the fact that an unmarried man is living here to suggest that my judgment is." She stopped. "Compromised," Owen said. "Yes." Owen's face went through a series of expressions that she suspected reflected a 13-year-old encountering the specific and infuriating reality that adults operate within systems that prioritize appearances over facts. "That's not fair," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know yet. Go read your book, Owen," he went. But she caught him, an hour later, doing something at the kitchen table, with a sheet of paper and a pencil that had the focused intensity of a boy working through a problem. She didn't ask what it was. She'd find out when he was ready to tell her, and probably sooner than she anticipated. She was right. It was Gideon who came to her that evening, after supper, after the boys were in bed. He came and sat at the kitchen table across from her, and put his hands flat on the wood and said, "I've been offered a position." She looked up. Something cold moved through her that she did not let onto her face. "What kind of position?" "Foreman, Wyoming, cattle operation outside Laramie." He paused. "Letter was waiting at the post office when Luke and I went for the wire." I didn't say anything because he stopped, because I needed to think about it. The kitchen was quiet. "When did it come?" she said. "Week ago," they said. "It had been sitting there. It's a good offer." "It's an excellent offer." He said it flatly, like a man reporting a weather condition he didn't choose. "House, steady wage, stable position, good operation." He looked at his hands on the table. "Everything a man with 4 children ought to choose." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" He looked up. "Because I'm not going to take it without telling you first." She held his gaze. "I know what that offer is. I know what a responsible father is supposed to do when something like that arrives." His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it, the particular strain of a man who has thought himself in circles and come back to the same place every time. "I've been telling myself since Kansas that my only job is those 4 boys. That nothing else gets to matter more than what's right for them." "And," she said, "and Luke told me something last week. He told me that since we got to Silver Creek, since we've been here, Ben hasn't woken up screaming once." He stopped. "Not once, Hannah. In 8 months before this, I don't think there was a single night." And Owen's talking again, I mean really talking, the way he did before Eleanor got sick. And Wyatt, he laughed, brief and tired and real. Wyatt's Wyatt, but there's something different even in him. Something lighter. She didn't say anything. "And I look at those boys," he said. "And then I look at this ranch. And then I look at you. And I think. "Don't," she said. The word came out fast before she could stop it. He stopped. "Don't say it like it's only about them," she said. She said it quietly, but she said it, and she met his eyes when she did. "If you're going to say something, say what's actually true." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind picked up and moved through the dark. "I don't want to go," he said. "I want to stay. I want to stay because of my boys, and because of this ranch, and—" He stopped. "Because of you. All of it. That's what's true. The room held that." Hannah pressed her hand flat on the table. "Then stay," she said. I know it's not simple." Her voice was steady. "I know what people are saying in town. I know about Aldridge. I know what it looks like, an unmarried man living here, and I know the kind of pressure that's going to come from that direction." She paused. "I'm not asking you to solve all of it tonight. I'm telling you not to take that job." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you just told me you don't want to," she said. "And because I asked you not to, and that's enough for tonight." Gideon Walker looked at Hannah Calloway across that kitchen table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow, certain, the way he did everything. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "It should have been a resolution." It felt like one, sitting there in the kitchen with the fire low, and the wind outside, and the weight of the past 5 weeks settled between them, into something that had found, tentatively, a shape. What happened the next morning undid everything. Frank Aldridge came back. This time he didn't come alone. He came with a man Hannah recognized as Harold Stern, from the county land office. Not a bad man, not a corrupt one, just a man who did his job, and whose job could become very inconvenient if the right concerns were raised by the right people. Hannah met them in the yard. Gideon was at the north fence with Jeb and Luke. She was glad of that, and then was annoyed at herself for being glad, because she should not have to be glad that the man she had chosen to trust was out of sight. "Hannah," Aldridge said, warm, unhurried, the smile she had stopped trusting 3 years ago. "You know Harold, Mr. Stern," she said. "What can I do for you?" Stern had the look of a man who would rather be somewhere else. "Mrs. Calloway, I apologize for coming out unannounced. Mr. Aldridge raised some concerns with the county office, and given the nature of them, I was asked to come and have a conversation." "What nature of concern?" she said. "Not a question." "A demand," Aldridge said, pleasantly. "The nature of the living arrangements here, primarily. As a neighboring property owner and someone with the community's interest at heart, I felt it my responsibility to flag what might be a situation that what Frank is concerned about," Stern said, with the weary precision of a man trying to cut through performance, "is whether the current arrangements at Silver Creek, specifically the presence of an unmarried male resident, might present an issue under the county morality provision. Which is an old piece of law and frankly not one we invoke often." "But it exists," Aldridge said, helpfully. Hannah looked at Harold Stern. She looked at him steadily, and she did not let one thing she was feeling onto her face. "The morality provision," she said. "It's rarely used," Stern said again more quietly. "But it exists," Aldridge repeated. He spread his hands. "I'm only trying to protect you, Hannah. A widow, alone with an unmarried man and his children living here, people talk. And if the county were to receive a formal complaint—" "Is this a formal complaint?" she said. "Silence, Mr. Stern," she said. "Is this a formal complaint from Mr. Aldridge to the county office?" Stern looked uncomfortable. "Not yet formally filed, no. Then Mr. Aldridge rode out here to threaten me with the possibility of one," she said. "In front of a county official. Which means you rode out here to watch him threaten me." She kept her voice level. "Is that the correct understanding of the situation?" Stern's jaw moved. He wasn't a bad man. She could see him knowing that. "Mrs. Calloway, I would like to know," she said, "what the morality provision specifically requires." "In plain language," Stern sighed. "In plain language, the provision can be invoked if there is evidence of cohabitation outside of marriage that creates a public concern or—" "Outside of marriage," she said. "Yes. So if the arrangement were within marriage," she said, "there would be no provision to invoke." Stern blinked. "Well, no, there wouldn't." Aldridge's smile went slightly fixed. "Hannah, thank you, Mr. Stern," she said. "I appreciate the clarification." She looked at Aldridge and felt something settle in her, cold and final and absolutely certain. "Frank, I think you know where the road out is." Aldridge looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. This isn't settled. Quietly. The pleasantness gone. No, she said. But you're done here today. She stood in the yard and watched them ride out. She stood there until the sound of the horses was gone. Then she turned around, and Gideon was standing 20 feet behind her. He had come back from the north fence. She looked at him. He looked at her. His face was completely composed, and she could see, just at the edges, just where the composure was working hardest, what he'd heard and what he was thinking about it. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. The wind moved between them. "Hannah," he said. His voice was different from last night. Quieter, more careful, like a man approaching something breakable. "I have to ask you something." "I know," she said. "Do you know what you're—" "I know what I said," she said. "To Stern, about the provision, if you said it to end the conversation." "I don't say things to end conversations," she said. "You know that about me." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed at both of them. "I know that about you," he said. "Then don't ask me if I meant it." He was quiet. She could see him working through it, this man who did things right and built things to last and had said, 2 nights ago, "I will not be something that happened to her." She could see him trying to locate the line between pushing forward and respecting the ground she stood on. "Hannah," he said, "I have 4 children, I know that. You'd be taking on Gideon." She looked at him directly. "I know what I'd be taking on. I've been living with it for 5 weeks. That's not a surprise. That's the whole point." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. "I'm not asking you today," she said. "I'm not asking you this week. I'm telling you that Aldridge is not going to use that provision against this ranch, and I'm telling you why it's not going to work." She paused. "What happens after that is a conversation we haven't had yet." "But we're going to have it," he said. "Yes," she said. "We are." Something shifted in his face, the composure giving way, just briefly, to something underneath it that was so close to relief and so close to hope and so completely unguarded that she had to look away. Because looking at it directly felt like standing too close to a fire after a very long time in the cold. She walked back toward the house. She got 3 steps before Ben came flying out of the barn door at full speed, skidded on the frozen ground, caught himself on the fence post, and yelled, "Miss Hannah! Bandit caught a mouse, a real mouse, come see!" She stopped. She looked at this muddy, bright-eyed, absolutely unkillable 6-year-old, and she thought about what it had felt like to pull him out of that frozen creek bank, and what it felt like every morning when he came and stood beside her chair, and she thought, this is the whole point. This exact thing, right here. "Go put that mouse back outside," she said. "He already ate it. Then go congratulate Bandit and wash your hands." Ben stared at her. "Both?" "Both." Ben considered the inefficiency of this, and then decided it wasn't a battle worth having. "Okay," he said, and ran back into the barn. Hannah stood in the yard and let out a long, slow breath. Behind her, she heard Gideon make a sound, just a sound, not quite a laugh. Not quite not, the kind of sound a man makes when something has gone straight to the center of him and he has no other way to answer it. She didn't turn around. "Go check the north fence," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, still that sound in his voice, warm and low. She went inside. Owen was at the kitchen table. He had 3 pages of notes in front of him, and he looked up when she came in with the particular expression of a boy who has been waiting to say something since this morning and has been exercising extraordinary restraint. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "You handled Aldridge correctly," Owen said. She looked at him. "Thank you, Owen." "He'll try something else," Owen said. "He's not done." "I know, the provision, Owen, was specifically a county-level measure from 1871, and it's never actually been upheld in a territorial court." He slid one of his pages across the table. "I found the original filing records in the back of the county almanac you have in the sitting room." Hannah picked up the page. She read it. She looked at Owen. "You found this in my almanac." "In about 20 minutes," he said. He's bluffing. Even if he files formally, the provision doesn't have teeth. She set the page down slowly. Yes, ma'am. You are 13 years old. Yes, ma'am. How did you know to look for this? My father taught me that when someone threatens you with the law, Owen said, with the level calm of a person who has arrived at a conclusion by a well-constructed route, you find out exactly what the law says before you decide whether to be afraid of it. Hannah sat down at the table. She looked at this boy, this 13-year-old boy with his Tennyson and his almanac and his father's eyes, and she thought about what Gideon had said last night. Owen's talking again. Really talking the way he did before Eleanor got sick. Your father taught you well, she said. Owen's face went through something quiet and private and real. He's a good teacher, he said. He just forgets that sometimes. I'll remind him, Hannah said. Owen looked at her. Are we staying, he said. Not like Ben, not with Ben's bright certainty. With the careful, guarded hope of a boy who has stopped himself from hoping before, because it hurts more that way. She held his gaze. Yes, she said, you're staying. Owen nodded. He picked up his notes, organized them precisely, and went back to reading without another word. And she understood that his silence was the same thing as Ben's crayon going back to the paper, the signal of a child who has received the answer he needed and can now finally exhale. She put the kettle on. Through the window, she could see Gideon at the north fence line with Luke, working in the cold with the particular steady rhythm of men who know exactly what they're doing. She watched them for a moment, the set of Luke's shoulders beside his father's, the way they moved in easy proximity, the way Luke said something, and Gideon nodded. And then Luke looked at the house, just briefly, then looked away. She thought about Aldridge riding back to town. She thought about what he would do next, and she thought about Owen's almanac notes, and she thought about the morality provision, and the county, and the way Stern had looked when she'd said within marriage. She thought about a wrong letter from a bureau in Billings. She thought about a tired man on a train platform with 4 boys and a hat in his hands. She thought about all of it for a long time, standing at that window with the kettle warming up behind her. Then she thought about what Gideon had said last night. I don't want to go, I want to stay, because of you. And she thought about what she had said back, and that she had meant it, every word, and that the only question left, the one real question that had been circling both of them, since that train station in Miles City, was not whether, but when, and how, and what exactly a woman who had stopped believing in soft landings did with the fact that she'd been given one. She thought about that for a long time, too. Outside, Wyatt emerged from the barn, holding what appeared to be a piece of tack equipment he had taken apart, and was now attempting to put back together while walking, which was Wyatt's standard approach to most projects, and which had, to everyone's ongoing astonishment, a reasonably high success rate. He walked past the fence. Gideon said something. Wyatt stopped, looked at the piece of equipment, said something back. Luke reached over and turned a piece of it the other way. Wyatt looked at it, tried it, something clicked into place. Wyatt looked up at his father and his brother, and grinned so wide it was visible from the kitchen window. Gideon shook his head, she could see it, the small movement, the thing under it that wasn't exasperation, and went back to the fence. Hannah turned away from the window. She poured the water. She made 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it, her cup, his cup, the way it had arranged itself over 5 weeks into something that had stopped requiring thought. She set his cup at his place and sat down with her own, and the kitchen was quiet, and for the first time, since she'd put that letter in her pocket 8 days ago, the quiet felt like relief instead of pressure. Ben's drawings were on the windowsill, all 7 of them now. Horses and cats and dogs, and one that was clearly meant to be the whole ranch from above, the way a child imagines looking down on a place they have decided belongs to them. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at the letter, still on the table from this morning. She picked it up. She looked at it one more time, the Bureau's apologetic script, the careful official language, explanation of a clerical error that had sent a man 3 states in the wrong direction. Or the right one. She folded it. She crossed to the stove. She opened the firebox. She held the letter there for a moment. Then she let it go. She watched it catch, watched it curl at the edges and brighten and disappear quickly and completely, the way things went when they had finished being needed. She closed the firebox. She went back to her coffee and sat with the warmth of it, the warmth of the fire, the warmth of a kitchen that had people in it again. And she thought, all right, here's where we are. Here is what is real. And she found, sitting there in the quiet of a Sunday morning, that had turned into something neither of them had expected, that she could breathe easily in it, that the ground under her felt solid in a way it hadn't in 3 years. Not because nothing was uncertain, because plenty was, but because she was not standing on it alone. That was the thing, she thought. That was the whole thing. You could face a hard winter alone if you had to. She had done it. She knew exactly how to do it, but you didn't have to want to. She burned the letter on a Sunday and did not tell Gideon she'd done it. She didn't need to. He came in from the north fence an hour later, found his coffee waiting at his place, sat down across from her, and looked at the table where the letter had been. Then he looked at her. She met his eyes without explanation. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and said nothing, and she understood, in the particular wordless fluency they had developed over 6 weeks, that he understood completely. They drank their coffee in the quiet kitchen while Owen read in the next room, and Ben's boots thumped overhead, and Wyatt's voice floated in from somewhere outside, explaining something to the gray cat with the earnest authority of a boy who has never once doubted his own expertise in any subject. I have to go into town tomorrow, Hannah said. I know. He turned his cup on the table. You want company? She looked at him. I want you to stay here and get the south herd moved before the temperature drops again. That's not what I asked. She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. I don't want company. I need to handle Aldridge on my own ground. He didn't argue. That was one of the things about him. He knew the difference between concern and interference, and he stayed on the right side of it. All right, he said. But Gideon, she set her cup down. When I come back, we need to have that conversation. He looked at her steadily. I know one we said we'd have. I know, Hannah. She nodded once. Then she got up and started supper, and the kitchen filled with the smell of salt pork and the sound of Ben thundering back down the stairs, and the conversation folded itself into the rest of the evening, and waited. She rode into Miles City alone at first light. The cold was serious now, the kind that found the gaps in your coat and made itself comfortable. She tied her horse outside the county building and went straight to Harold Stern's office without stopping to speak to anyone, which was the right strategy with a town that was already talking. Stern looked up when she came in and had the grace to look uncomfortable. She sat down across from his desk without being invited and put Owen's notes, which she had recopied, in her own hand, because she was the landowner and it should be her handwriting flat on the desk between them. The 1871 provision, she said. I'd like you to look at page 3. Stern looked at the notes. He picked them up. He read. His expression shifted from uncomfortable to something more careful. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Where did you— It's in the county almanac, she said. Section 4, filed under land use ordinances. She waited while he read. The provision has never been upheld in a territorial court. It was written for a different set of circumstances in a different decade. And any formal filing under it would require a sworn complaint from a neighboring landowner, which would make Mr. Aldridge's motivations a matter of public record. She paused. I think we both understand what those motivations are. Stern set the notes down. He looked at her for a long moment. Frank Aldridge has been interested in this land for some time. 3 years since Daniel died. Stern nodded slowly. Mrs. Calloway, I want you to know, and I want this to be clear, that this office has no interest in pursuing an action that isn't warranted. The provision exists, but he stopped. But its application here would require a demonstration of genuine public concern, not a neighbor's commercial interest dressed up as one. I appreciate that, she said. I want it documented that I came here, that I raised this, and that the office is aware of the nature of Aldridge's interest. Stern looked at her for another moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a ledger. I'll make a note, he said. date and time of your visit, and the substance of the conversation. Thank you. She stood, picked up her notes. Mrs. Calloway. He said it before she reached the door. She turned. He had the look of a man saying something he wasn't entirely authorized to say. The provision, as written, the most straightforward resolution, is the one you alluded to yourself. When you spoke to Aldridge, he cleared his throat. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply noting what the law says. She looked at him steadily. I know what the law says, Mr. Stern. She walked out. She did not go home immediately. She went to the dry goods store and completed her supplies order, and she spoke to Mrs. Hargrove with exactly the same composure she always brought to that counter, and she did not give that woman or anyone else in that store anything to read in her face. Then she stopped at the post office, because she needed stamps and because stopping at the post office looked like the ordinary business of a rancher in town, which was all she needed it to look like. It was at the post office that she ran into Clara Brewster. Clara was 60, rancher's widow, built like someone had assembled her out of iron wire and good intentions, and she had been Hannah's nearest neighbor for 11 years. She was also, as far as Hannah could tell, completely immune to other people's opinions, which was a quality Hannah had always respected at a safe distance. Hannah. Clara took her by the arm before she could get inside. I've been meaning to ride out Clara. I heard about Aldridge. Clara said it flat and fast with the directness of a woman who had no patience for the approach. He was at the church social last Thursday, telling anyone who'd listen that you'd lost your judgment. Hannah felt her jaw set. Is that what he said? He said a woman alone makes poor decisions. Clara's eyes were sharp and unapologetic. He said having a strange man and his children living in your house showed a lack of discernment. And what did the people listening say? Clara's expression shifted into something that was almost satisfaction. Well, that rather depended on who was listening. She paused. Mabel Hatch said she thought it was brave. Ann Pierce said she'd have done the same in your position. Tom Petty said Aldridge had been circling that property like a buzzard for 3 years, and maybe the lady just needed someone to do the fencing. Clara tilted her head. Tom's not wrong. Hannah looked at her. Clara, why are you telling me this? Because Aldridge is going to file something, Clara said, without preamble. I don't know when and I don't know exactly what, but he's not going to let this go. He's invested too much pride in it. She tightened her grip on Hannah's arm briefly, then let go. I want you to know that if you need people to speak on your behalf on the character of your operation and the people in it, you have them. Hannah stood with that for a moment. You've seen them. The Walkers. Jeb buys his tobacco from the same place my foreman does, Clara said. Jeb is not a man who expresses opinions freely. A pause. He told my foreman that the Walker man reset a fence post last month that's been causing trouble for 2 years, before sunup, on his own time. And that the oldest boy has better instincts with cattle than some grown men he's known. She looked at Hannah directly. That's Jeb's version of a standing ovation. Hannah felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Thank you, Clara. Don't thank me. Just don't let that man take your land. Clara said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Or your life. He's been after both. Hannah rode home thinking about Clara Brewster, and Mabel Hatch, and Ann Pierce, and Tom Petty, who'd said she just needed someone to do the fencing. And she thought about how much of the world you missed when you spent 3 years looking down at your own boots, just to keep moving forward. She'd missed quite a bit. She saw that now. She got back to Silver Creek in the early afternoon and found the south herd moved, the north fence extended by 2 full sections, and Wyatt on the roof of the small barn doing something with the shingle that she decided, on reflection, not to inquire into too closely. He's been up there an hour, Luke said, appearing beside her. It's fine, he fixed the leak. She looked at Luke. He fixed the leak, the one over the grain storage. It's been there since August. She looked up at Wyatt, who waved at her with the confidence of someone who does not believe in heights as a concept. She looked back at Luke. Where's your father back pasture? Luke hesitated. Just a fraction. He found something. She was already moving. What kind of something? He'll tell you himself, Luke said. Mrs. Calloway. She stopped, looked back at him. He had that old man look in his young face, the careful, contained look of someone who has held too much responsibility for too long. He tore up the Wyoming letter this morning. She went very still. When this morning? Early, before you left for town. Luke held her gaze. He didn't say anything. He just took it out of his coat and tore it in half and put it in the stove. A pause. I thought you should know. She held Luke Walker's gaze for a moment, this 16-year-old, who carried his father's steadiness and his mother's ghost and the weight of a family on shoulders that had never once buckled under it, and she felt a wave of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite grief and was entirely too large to name in the cold of a Montana afternoon. Thank you, Luke, she said. She found Gideon at the back pasture fence. He was crouched down, examining something at the base of a post, and he heard her coming and straightened and turned, and his face went through a quick, private thing that he mostly managed before she was close enough to read it. Luke said you found something, she said. Post rot, he said. Here and here. He pointed to 2 spots along the fence line. I want to replace them before the ground freezes solid. Once it does, we're looking at a spring job. She looked at the posts. She looked at him. How long? If I start tomorrow, 2 days. 3 if the cold gets worse. Start tomorrow, she said. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, reading her the way he always read her, with that calm, accurate attention. How was town? Productive, she said. Stern isn't going to move against us. Not without a formal complaint, and if Aldridge files one, his motivations become public record. She paused. Clara Brewster says she'll speak on our behalf if it comes to that. Something shifted in his face. Clara Brewster, you know her? Jebs mentioned her. He paused. She's the one who sent her foreman over to help when we moved the south herd. Hannah looked at him last Tuesday. Big man, red beard. Said Mrs. Brewster figured you could use an extra hand for the move. He watched her face. You didn't know. I didn't know, she said. She stood with that for a moment, the particular texture of it, being helped without being asked, by someone who had seen what she needed, and simply sent it. She had forgotten that happened. She had spent 3 years doing everything alone, and had forgotten that people sometimes just helped. Gideon, she said. Yeah, Luke told me about the Wyoming letter. He was quiet for a moment. I should have told you myself. It's done, she said. I just want to know, are you sure? He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her, no evasion, no performance, just the honest, inconvenient attention of a man who means what he says. I was sure the night I told you I didn't want to go, he said. The letter was just, it was still in my coat. I kept carrying it, and I don't know why, because the answer was already settled. He paused. I burned it because I didn't want it in the house anymore. She held his gaze. The wind moved between them, cold and clean. Gideon, she said, I went and saw Stern today, and I told him that the provision wouldn't hold. She stopped. I told him because it's true. The law doesn't support what Aldridge is trying to do. I know, he said. But Stern said something. He said the most straightforward resolution was the one I'd already mentioned. She looked at him. When I talked to Aldridge, Gideon was still. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what she was saying and what it cost her to say it this directly. And he stood in the cold of the back pasture and let her say it without rushing her. I'm not asking you right now, she said. I told you not today, not this week. But I need you to know that it's not just about Aldridge. I need you to know that when it happens, if it happens, it's because I chose it. She held his gaze. Not because a provision forced me into it. You understand the difference. I understand the difference, he said. His voice was quiet and certain, and she believed him completely. Hannah, I told you in the kitchen I will not be something that happened to you. I know. She paused. I'm telling you it won't be. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for the information being exchanged, and she let it be long, and he said, All right. All right, she said. She turned to head back to the house, and she'd taken 4 steps when he said Hannah, and she stopped. I've been doing the cattle weight projections, the south herd. If the weight holds through December the way it's tracking, you're looking at a profitable spring sale. First one in 3 years, she said, without turning around. First one in 3 years, he said. I thought you should know. She stood with her back to him for a moment. 3 years of fighting to stay even, fighting to hold on, fighting to make the arithmetic work. And now a man was standing in her back pasture, telling her the arithmetic had changed. She turned around. He was looking at her with that face, the composed, careful face that she had learned to see through, and underneath it was something simple and real, and entirely his. Thank you, she said. You did the work, he said. The rotation, the feed decisions, the south herd timing. I just ran the numbers on what you'd already built. She looked at him for another moment, then she went inside. The conversation she'd been waiting for happened that evening after supper in the most ordinary possible circumstances, which was, she had come to understand, how the important things happened in real life. Not in dramatic moments, in the gaps between them. The boys had gone up, the hands had turned in. She was going over the weekly accounts, and he was at the other end of the table, doing the fence post calculations, and the fire was low and the kitchen was warm. And she said, without looking up from the ledger, Owen showed me the almanac notes. I know, he said. He's extraordinary. He is. He's been extraordinary since he was about 4. Eleanor used to say it was like raising a small, very polite professor. She looked up at that. He was looking at his calculations, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of a man who has said a name he doesn't say often. What was she like? Hannah said. She said it carefully, the way you ask a question you mean to ask and are not sure you have the right to. He was quiet for a moment. He said, she didn't panic. About anything. When the drought started and I was climbing the walls, she just worked. Said that worrying about what you couldn't fix left no energy for what you could. He turned his pencil on the table. She would have liked you. Hannah looked at him. Why? Because you do the same thing. He met her eyes. You don't waste motion on what you can't change. You just figure out what you can and go at it. A pause. I spent 6 months after she died feeling like the ground had gone. He stopped. I wasn't, he stopped again. Tried differently. The boys needed me to be all right faster than I was. I tried. I don't know how well I managed. You managed well enough, she said. Luke told me about Ben's nightmares and how they stopped. He looked at his hands. Yeah, that's not nothing, Gideon. That's everything. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure when I came here. I kept thinking I was doing this for them. That it was all for the boys. He looked at her. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, I stopped being able to pretend that was the whole truth. The kitchen was very quiet. I know, she said. Hannah. I know, she said again. Steady, clear. I've known for a while. He held her gaze. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the Montana dark pressed flat and permanent against the windows. Daniel was a good man, she said. She said it the way she didn't always let herself say things directly, without armor. He worked hard and he loved this place and he loved me in the way that a good man loves what he's built. And I loved him, she paused, but he's been gone 3 years. And I've been stopped, took a breath. I have been so afraid of needing something. Because if you need it and it goes, the losing, Gideon said. Quiet, yes, she looked at him. You know. She put her hands flat on the table. I'm still afraid of it, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. But I've been more afraid of the alternative. She met his eyes. I've been more afraid of not of spending the rest of my life managing this land and being fine and never. She stopped. He waited. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited, steady and patient the way he always was. I don't want to just be fine, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, neither do I. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he reached across the table, not fast, not dramatic, just with the calm deliberateness of a man who does what he means to do, and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers on the kitchen table, warm and solid and present. She turned her hand over. She held on. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet kitchen, while the fire burned low and the Montana wind moved outside and the house around them held its breath. It was Ben who broke it, because it was always Ben. He appeared at the top of the stairs in his nightshirt, hair standing in all directions, looking down at them with the bleary authority of a 6-year-old who has woken up and found the house still occupied and sees no reason to return to sleep without establishing the situation. "Pa," he said, "I can't find my sock." Gideon did not let go of Hannah's hand immediately. He tilted his head back and looked up at his youngest son. "Which sock?" "The left one. Then put on the right one and go back to sleep." Ben processed this. "Then my foot will be cold. The blanket will fix that." Ben looked at Hannah. "Miss Hannah," he said, with the particular tone of a child escalating to a higher authority. "My sock go back to bed, Ben," Hannah said. He stood there for another moment, looking between them, and something in his small face shifted, something observant and satisfied and absolutely unsurprised, as though the universe had, in some essential way, confirmed what he had already decided was true. "Okay," he said, and went back to bed. Gideon looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Gideon. Something between them broke open into something that was not quite a laugh and was better than one real and quiet and warm. The laughter of two people who have arrived at the same place by roads they wouldn't have chosen and find themselves improbably glad. She pressed her other hand over his. He turned his up to hold both of hers. They were still sitting like that, hands together across the kitchen table, when Luke came downstairs at midnight for water and stopped dead in the doorway. He looked at them. They looked at him. His face did the thing it always did when something mattered, went very still, very controlled, and then cracked open at the edges into something young and unguarded and real. "Sorry," he said. "Water." "The pump's where it always is," Hannah said. "Yes, ma'am." He crossed to the pump without looking at them again, filled his cup, and crossed back to the doorway. He stopped there, stood with his back to them for a moment. "Luke," Gideon said. "Yeah, Pa, right?" Luke turned around. He looked at his father, and he looked at Hannah, and he said, "Yeah." He said it with a steadiness that was all his own, that he had earned through years of carrying things he shouldn't have had to carry and doing it anyway. "Yeah, I'm all right." He went back upstairs. Hannah listened to his footsteps on the stairs and thought about the morning he'd come to her. In the south pasture, the horse with the tender leg, the frank and careful words, "He hasn't been happy in a long time, Mrs. Calloway." She thought about what it took for a 16-year-old boy to say that to a near stranger. What it cost him and what he'd decided it was worth. "He's been watching out for you," she said. "Luke." "Since before you knew what this was." "I know," Gideon said. "He's been watching out for everyone since he was 12. A pause. "Too long." "Yes," she said, "too long." She looked at their joint hands. "You can let him put it down now." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on it," he said. The week that followed was the quietest and the most consequential week Silver Creek Ranch had seen in 3 years, and most of it happened in the small, ordinary moments that don't look like anything from the outside. Monday, Gideon started on the post replacements, and Luke and Jeb worked alongside him, and Cal said to Pete, at some point in the afternoon, that the fence line was going to be the best it had been since the ranch was built. And Pete grunted and said that wasn't nothing, and that was as close to celebration as that fence line was going to get. Tuesday, Owen presented Hannah with a revised version of the quarterly account structure, the one that had been set up under Daniel's system, reorganized in a way that made the numbers cleaner and the cash flow easier to track. He presented it without ceremony, the way he did everything, and she went through it carefully and found that he'd caught 2 additional inefficiencies she hadn't spotted, and she told him so. And he went back to his book with the expression of someone who has done a good job and knows it and does not require further recognition. Wednesday, Frank Aldridge did not appear. This was notable. She had expected him by Wednesday. She asked Cal, who had good ears, to listen carefully during the next supply run, and Cal reported back that Aldridge had apparently had a conversation with Harold Stern that had not gone the way Aldridge had expected. that Stern had mentioned in not so many words, that the county office was aware of the nature of Aldridge's interest in the Calloway property and would be evaluating any formal complaint accordingly. Clara Brewster, Hannah thought. Clara had clearly also had a word with someone. Thursday brought the hardest cold, yet the real beginning of winter, not the preview. The kind of cold that settled in and meant it. Hannah and Gideon and all three older boys worked from before sunrise until after dark, moving the remaining cattle to the winter pasture, breaking ice in every trough, shoring up the windbreaks, making sure the feed stores were accessible. It was the hardest single day of work she had done since the first winter after Daniel died, and at the end of it she was so tired. Her hands shook slightly when she poured the evening coffee. Gideon noticed. He took the pot from her without comment and poured it himself and set hers in front of her and sat down, and she was too tired to argue about it and too grateful to pretend she was. "South Herd secure," he said. "I know. I was there." "I know you were." He drank his coffee. "You worked as hard as any two of the men today." "This is my ranch." He looked at her. "I'm not arguing with you. I'm telling you that you're allowed to be tired." She held his gaze. She was tired. She was deeply, bone-level tired, the way you got when you had been fighting for a long time, and the fight was not quite over, but the terms of it had changed in a way you were only beginning to understand. "I'm tired," she said. It came out simpler than she intended. "Just a statement of fact." "I know," he said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same as that night, easy and certain. "You can be, it's all right." She looked at his hand on hers. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah, I want to do this properly." He was quiet. "What do you mean properly?" She stopped. "Started again. I want it to be a choice, a real one. Not something we backed into because of Aldridge, not something driven by a provision." She met his eyes. "I want to ask you when I'm ready, and I want it to mean what it means." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "I'm not ready tonight," she said. "I know you're not. But she stopped. "I'm close." He turned his hand over and held hers properly warm and firm, and without any of the tentativeness of someone who doesn't know if they're allowed. "I'll be here," he said. Friday arrived with a complication nobody had anticipated. It was Luke who found it, going through the mail that Cal brought from town. A letter, official paper, addressed to Gideon Walker in care of the Silver Creek Ranch. Return address, Laramie, Wyoming. Luke stood with it for a moment. Then he took it to his father. Gideon read it in the barn, alone, and came back to the house with his jaws set and his face closed in the particular way it went when he was containing something large. He found Hannah at the kitchen table and sat down and put the letter in front of her, without preamble. She read it. It was from the Wyoming cattle operation. They had heard he'd declined their initial offer. They were extending a second one. More money, better terms, a house larger than what they'd initially described, and a provision clearly designed for a specific situation that offered accommodation for a family of 4 children and a wife, should he be bringing one. Someone had told them about Silver Creek. Someone had told them about Hannah. She read it down. "Aldridge," she said. "That's my guess," Gideon said. She looked at the letter. "He told them about us, hoping they'd make a better offer. Hoping you'd take it." She looked up. "Hoping I'd lose you and the operation both." "That's how I read it," Gideon said. His voice was even. "He's been thorough." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was very still. "Gideon," she said. "I already know what I'm going to do with it," he said. "I know you do," she said, "but that's not what I was going to say." He waited. She picked up the letter. She looked at it one more time, the Wyoming cattle operation's careful cursive, the generous terms, the house, the provision for a family including a wife. She thought about a man who had torn up the first letter without telling her and only told her after because his son did. She thought about a man who said, "I will not be something that happened to her," and meant every word of it. She put the letter down. "I'm ready," she said. He went very still. "I told you I'd ask when I was ready," she said, "and I'm ready." She met his eyes directly, the way she met everything, without flinching, without softening, without making it smaller than it was. "This letter, it's not why. I want to be clear about that. It's not Aldridge, and it's not the provision, and it's not because I'm backed into anything." She paused. "It's because I watched you tear up the first letter and not tell me. And it's because you held my hand across this table, and it felt like something I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting." She paused again. "And it's because Ben puts his boots on the wrong feet every morning, and I've started looking forward to fixing them." Gideon looked at her across the table. His face did what it almost never did, gave everything up at once. No composure, no careful steadiness, just the thing underneath all of it, open and real and entirely certain. "Hannah Calloway," he said. "Gideon Walker," she said. "I'll build you whatever you need," he said, "on this land. Whatever the ranch needs, whatever you need. I'll be here." "I know you will," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He stood up. She stood up. They were on the same side of the table, close, and he put his hands on either side of her face, and she let him, and she put her hands against his chest, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Just stood there in the warm kitchen with the fire at their backs and the Montana dark outside, and the weight of 6 weeks and 2 dead spouses and 4 children and 1 wrong letter from a placement bureau in Billings, held between them like something finally set down. Then Ben's voice came from upstairs, loud and entirely awake. "Pa. Pa, I found the sock." They stood absolutely still. "It was in my boot." Ben called, informational, pleased with himself. The whole time, Hannah pressed her forehead against Gideon's shoulder. He put his arms around her. She felt him laugh quietly, fully, a laugh that came from somewhere deep and real and long closed off. She laughed too. "Owen," said Ben, "go to sleep." "But I found the Benjamin." Silence. Gideon pressed his face into her hair. She held on. The fire settled in the grate. Outside Silver Creek Ranch, held against the Montana dark, the same way it always had, steadily, stubbornly, with everything it had. Only now it wasn't holding alone. The sock was still in Ben's hand when he came downstairs the next morning. He carried it like evidence, which it was evidence of last night's triumph, a small victory over the universe that he intended to document fully before moving on to breakfast. He put it on the kitchen table beside his father's coffee cup and looked at Hannah with the expression of a boy who expects acknowledgement. "Good morning, Ben," Hannah said. "I found it," he said. "I heard. Owen said I already told everyone." He picked up the sock. "But I wanted to show you." She looked at the sock. At him. At the absolute seriousness in his small face, the bright dark eyes, the hair doing 4 things at once. "That's a fine sock," she said. Ben appeared deeply satisfied by this. He put the sock in his pocket for safekeeping. She assumed and climbed into his chair and waited for breakfast with the patience of someone whose morning has already been a success. Gideon came in from outside, coat cold, face weather-bitten, moving with the particular quiet energy of a man who has been up since before light and already done something with the time. He looked at Ben first, always Ben first. She had noticed. The same involuntary check-in, the way you check the temperature of a room you'd learned, could change fast. Ben was fine. Ben was showing Owen the sock. Gideon looked at Hannah. She looked back. Something moved between them, not dramatic, not performed, just the simple private recognition of 2 people who had said true things to each other the night before, and had woken up still meaning them. He held her gaze for a moment, then went to the stove, and she put biscuits on the table, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells that had become, over 7 weeks, the specific texture of a morning at Silver Creek Ranch. Luke came down last. He looked at his father. His father looked at him. Something passed between them that was old and private, and then Luke looked at Hannah with the careful, measured gaze of a boy who has been hoping for something for a long time and is only now allowing himself to believe it. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Luke." "Morning, morning," she said. He sat down. He ate. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to, because the set of his shoulders was different from every morning before it, lighter, in the specific way that only happens when something you've been bracing against turns out not to hit. They had not made any announcement. There was nothing to announce yet, no date set, no preacher called, nothing formal in place. But the house knew. The way houses know things, through the quality of the silences and the way people moved in the spaces between each other. It knew, and it was quiet about it, and that quiet felt like something settling, rather than something withheld. Wyatt was the one who said it out loud, because Wyatt was always the one who said it out loud. He came in from the barn mid-morning. He'd been out, since before breakfast, doing something with the tack that nobody had asked him to do, but that apparently needed doing, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at his father and then Hannah, and then back at his father, with the expression of someone assembling information that has been available for weeks and choosing this particular moment to finalize the picture. "Are you two getting married?" he said. The kitchen went entirely still. Ben looked up from his drawing. Owen appeared in the sitting room doorway, with his book open, and his finger keeping his place, which meant he'd been listening and had been waiting for someone to bring this into the open. Gideon looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Wyatt. That, she said, is not a question a 10-year-old asks at 9 in the morning. It's an honest question, Wyatt said, without any apparent concern for its reception. Pa's different. You're different. The whole house is different. He spread his hands. I'm just asking what everyone's thinking. Wyatt, Luke said from the table. What am I wrong? Silence. Ben put down his crayon. I want them to get married, he said, with the calm finality of a child who has already decided and sees no reason not to say so. Then Miss Hannah would be He stopped, looked at Hannah with a sudden uncertainty that was, of all the expressions she had ever seen on his face, the most unguarded. What would you be? The kitchen was very still. Hannah looked at this 6-year-old boy who had leaned against her arm the first morning and never stopped, who had brought her crayon drawings and asked about Rufus and told her he'd help her not be sad, who had fallen asleep on her lap in frozen mud and trusted her completely from the very first moment with the absolute animal certainty of a child who has recognized something true before his brain can explain it. She pulled out the chair next to his and sat down. I'd be yours, she said, if that's what you want. Ben looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was too old for 6 and too real for mourning, the particular gravity of a child who has lost something irreplaceable and knows it and is being very careful with what comes next. Like a mama, he said, very quietly. The word landed in the room the way certain words land, not loudly, but with a weight that shifted the air around it. She felt Gideon go still behind her. She felt Luke at the table not moving. Owen in the doorway had stopped pretending to read. Even Wyatt had gone quiet, which was the rarest weather Silver Creek Ranch had produced in 7 weeks. She put her hand on Ben's. I can't be what you already had, she said, carefully. Honestly, because he deserved honesty more than comfort. Nobody can be that, but I can be here every morning. Every day. She held his gaze. Would that be enough? Ben thought about it, really thought about it, with the seriousness he brought to all his important considerations. Then he nodded, once the way his father nodded, and certain and final. Okay, he said, and picked up his crayon and went back to drawing. Wyatt let out a breath. So that's a yes, he said. Wyatt, Gideon said. I know what you're just. But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite reprimand, and Wyatt heard it the same as everyone else and grinned at his shoes and went back outside. Owen looked at Hannah from the doorway. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that clear, thorough, 13-year-old precision. Then he looked at his father. Then he went back to reading, which was Owen's version of approval, so complete it didn't require expression. Luke stood up from the table. He carried his plate to the counter. He stood there a moment with his back to the room. Then eats Callaway, he said. Luke. If it's all right, he stopped. Try it again, when it's official. If it's all right with you. He looked at her directly, with the steadiness he'd had to grow too young. I'd like to call you something different than Mrs. Callaway. She looked at this boy who had held a family together through drought and debt and grief and a train ride across 3 states on the strength of a wrong letter, who had told her, in a cold south pasture, that his father hadn't been happy in a long time, who had carried the cup of water at midnight and turned in the doorway and said yeah with more feeling than most men put in a speech. You can call me Hannah, she said. Something happened to Luke Walker's face that was young and private and entirely real, and he turned back to the counter before anyone could see all of it, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," without thinking, and then caught himself. And she heard him quietly say, "Hannah," to the counter, just trying the word, just finding out what it weighed. She let it be. Some things didn't need witness. The formal conversation with Miles City came sooner than she'd planned, because Miles City didn't wait on anyone's timeline. Clara Brewster rode out on the Tuesday after unannounced, which was Clara's style, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, without preamble, Aldridge filed a complaint Monday morning. Hannah set down her cup. The provision. What else? Clara's voice was dry and unhurried. He found two men willing to sign statements supporting a public concern. She looked at Hannah directly. I know who they are. I won't say. What I will say is that neither of them has ever set foot on Silver Creek Ranch, and one of them owes Aldridge money. Gideon came in from outside and stopped just inside the doorway. Clara looked at him with frank assessment. He looked back at her with the same quality of attention. Two people reading each other. You'd be Walker, Clara said. Yes, ma'am, Clara Brewster. My land borders the eastern edge of Silver Creek. I know your foreman, he said, Redbeard, good with cattle. Clara looked at him a moment longer. Yes, she said. He is. She turned back to Hannah. The complaint is filed. Stern has to respond. She held up one hand. The response timeline is 60 days. Which gives you 60 days to resolve the provision before any county action. Hannah looked at her. You know a great deal about the county process. I've been running land in this county for 30 years, Clara said. I know everything about the county process. She drank her coffee. The question is what you're going to do with 60 days. The kitchen was quiet. Gideon was looking at Hannah. She was looking at her cup. Then she looked up at Clara. I'm going to get married, she said, simply, like it was a thing she'd already decided, which it was. Not because of the complaint, because it's what I want. She paused. But the timing is going to be what it is. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then at Gideon, then back at Hannah. All right, she said. Then you'll want Reverend Mills before the snow closes the road to town. Yes, Hannah said. I will. Clara stood up. I'll tell him you're coming. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Looked at Gideon. The fence work you did on the eastern line last month. The post setting, it held through the last 3 north winds. It should hold through the winter, he said. Good fencing, she said. This ranch needs good fencing. She said it as if it meant exactly what it said and also something more. Then she walked out, and they heard her horse, and she was gone. Gideon looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at the door Clara had just walked through, and then at her coffee, and then at him. You don't have to, he started. I said it because I meant it, she said. Not because of Aldridge and not because of 60 days. She held his gaze. I meant it before she got here. He was quiet for a moment. I know you did. Then stop looking like you're waiting for me to change my mind. Something shifted in his face, that warmth again, that deep, unguarded thing underneath the composure. Break it, she said. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. They rode into Miles City together on Thursday. Not the whole family. Ben stayed with Jeb, who had developed a patient tolerance for Ben's company that expressed itself as grunting slightly less frequently in his direction, which was, as far as Ben was concerned, an enthusiastic endorsement. Wyatt stayed with Cal and the horses. Owen had been invited to come and had looked at the pile of county almanacs he was still working through and declined with the solemnity of a man who has pressing engagements. Only Luke rode with them. He rode behind them, giving them the space a 16-year-old knows to give without being told, and Hannah was aware of him back there, steady and quiet. The same way he was always steady and quiet, and she thought about what it would mean to him this day. What it had already cost him, and what it was going to give back. Reverend Mills was a small man with large hands, and the particular quality of calm that some men of faith develop after enough years of standing beside people on the most important days of their lives. He looked at the three of them and did not ask unnecessary questions. "You're sure," he said, to both of them, equally, which she respected. "Yes," Hannah said. "Yes," Gideon said. Reverend Mills looked at Luke. "Your witness?" "Yes, sir," Luke said. His voice was even. His hands, Hannah noticed, were not entirely steady. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm. Just once, just for a moment. He looked at her, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was its own kind of promise, not the same as the one she was about to make his father, but adjacent to it, part of the same fabric. He straightened. He was steady after that. It was a simple ceremony. The way she'd wanted everything about this simple, deliberate, real. No performance, no ornamentation. Just two people saying true things to each other in front of a reverend and a 16-year-old boy who was holding himself together with everything he had and doing a magnificent job of it. When it was done and Reverend Mills said it was done, Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her hand the same way he'd taken it across the kitchen table, easy and certain, like a man who knows what he's holding and intends to keep holding it. Luke let out one long, slow breath. Then he straightened his shoulders, and he was Luke again, composed, careful, carrying what he carried. But the set of it was different, lighter. She could see it. "Congratulations," he said. He said it to both of them, with the precision of a boy who has thought about the word and decided it's the right one. "Thank you," Gideon said. He put his free hand on the back of his son's neck for a moment, brief and firm, the way fathers touch sons when there are no words sufficient. Luke pressed into it for just a second, then they both let go. They rode home in the cold and the clear, and the sky over Montana was the particular deep blue of a winter afternoon that has decided to be beautiful whether you're looking or not, and the land ran out in every direction with the flat, enormous indifference of country that does not care about your feelings, but will hold you up regardless. Hannah held on to the reins and felt the ring on her hand, plain and simple, Gideon's mother's, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket since Kansas, which he had told her about only that morning, which she had said yes to without hesitation, and she thought, here it is. Here is the thing you stopped believing in. She thought about Daniel. She held him honestly, the way she'd learned to hold him, not with guilt, not with apology, but with the clear-eyed love of someone who knows that grief and gratitude are not opposites. He had been a good man, and she had loved him, and he was gone, and she was still here, and being still here had turned out to mean something she hadn't known how to expect. She thought, I think you would have liked him. I think you would have liked all of them. She let the thought sit, let it be true without making it more complicated than it was. Beside her, Gideon rode with the quiet ease of a man coming home. They heard the ranch before they saw it. Wyatt's first, always Wyatt's voice first. The irreducible signal that Wyatt Walker was present and operational rising from somewhere near the barn in animated and one-sided argument with what turned out to be the gray roan gelding about. Something that Wyatt considered a matter of principle. Then Jeb's voice, low and uninflected, delivering a short sentence that shut Wyatt down entirely, which was a feat that even Wyatt's own father could not always accomplish. Then Ben. Ben saw the wagon from the gate and came running, both arms going, coat half open, boots correct for once, which meant he'd had help this morning, which meant Jeb had quietly helped him and would deny it if asked. He came across the yard at full speed and hit the fence post to stop himself and yelled, "Are you married?" The yard went quiet. Jeb appeared in the barn doorway. Cal and Pete came around the corner of the feed store. Wyatt abandoned the roan and came at a run. Gideon set the brake. He looked at Hannah. "Are we?" he said, and the straightness of his face was a thing of extraordinary effort. "We are," she said. "Yes," Gideon called to Ben. Ben processed this for approximately 1 second. Then he turned around and yelled at the barn, "They're married." Jeb in the doorway looked at the sky. He appeared to be conducting an interior conversation. Then he looked at Hannah, and he did something she had never once seen him do in 11 years of knowing him. He nodded, once, slow, with a weight to it that was its own entire speech. She nodded back. Cal said something she didn't catch, and Pete laughed, which was so rare that Wyatt turned around to see what had caused it. Ben ran back across the yard and arrived at the wagon and looked up at both of them. Does that mean we're staying forever? He said. Yes, Hannah said. Ben looked at her, back at her. He had the expression of someone who has been hoping for something for a very long time and has now received it and finds it exactly what he expected, and is too full of it to produce noise, which was, for Ben Walker, the closest thing to stunned silence he was ever going to manage. Then he held up both arms. She climbed down from the wagon and picked him up. He was heavier than the first time, creek mud and panic, the frozen bank and his face against her shoulder. He was heavier now, and she held him just as easily, because some weights you carry, not because they're light, but because you've decided they're yours. You're home now, she said into his hair, all of you. He wrapped both arms around her neck and didn't say anything, which was how she knew he meant it more than anything he'd said in 7 weeks. Gideon climbed down beside her. He put his hand on her back, steady, warm, present. Luke came up beside him and stood there, and Wyatt arrived from the barn at his usual speed and inserted himself into the group with the physical certainty of a boy who believes he belongs everywhere. He plants his feet, which he did. And Owen appeared quietly at the edge of it all, book in hand, and stood close enough to be counted without being asked. Jeb crossed the yard toward them. He stopped 4 feet away. He looked at Gideon for a moment, with the measuring gaze of a man who takes the full measure of things before committing. Jeb, Gideon said. Jeb stuck out his hand. Gideon shook it. Jeb looked at Hannah. North Fence section'll need work before February, he said. Post 14 starting to give. I'll get it before January, Gideon said. Good. Jeb turned and went back to the barn, and that was Jeb's entire version of a wedding celebration. And it was, Hannah thought, one of the most sincere things anyone had said all day. She wrote to the placement bureau the following morning. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet, before anyone else was up, and she wrote it in her own clear hand on her good paper. She did not write it out of obligation or courtesy. She wrote it because she wanted there to be a record somewhere, in the files of a bureau in Billings, that had made the most consequential clerical error in the history of Silver Creek Ranch, that what had happened was known and named. She wrote, Dear Bureau of Territorial Placement, I am writing to inform you that the arrangement resulting from your error of last October has been resolved. Mr. Gideon Walker and I were married Thursday. His 4 sons are part of this family and part of this ranch. I understand that your error was unintentional. I want you to know that whatever its intention, its result has been the best thing that has happened to this property in 3 years. I do not offer this as an endorsement of clerical carelessness. I offer it as an honest account of the facts. The family this ranch was missing has been found. Sincerely, Hannah Walker. She set down the pen. She read it once. Then she folded it and sealed it, and put it by the door to go out with Cal on the next supply run. Gideon came downstairs at 4. He found her at the table with her coffee, and he looked at the sealed letter by the door, and he looked at her. Bureau, he said. Seemed right, she said. They should know what happened. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her, and they were quiet together in the way they were always quiet in the early morning, not the absence of something, but the presence of it. The specific comfort of 2 people who have found their ground and know what it feels like. What did you say? He asked. I said we got married. I said the boys are part of the ranch. I said it was the best thing that happened here in 3 years. He looked at his coffee. Is that true? She looked at him directly. You know it is. He nodded, drank his coffee. The fire settled in the grate. Gideon, she said. Yeah, the spring sale. If the cattle weight holds the way your projections show. It'll hold. Probably come in above projection. Then in the spring I want to talk about expanding the herd. She held his gaze. Long term. Proper expansion planned out right. The kind of expansion that needs someone who's going to be here in 10 years. He looked at her steadily. You're talking about building. I'm talking about building, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man who has been in motion for a very long time, always one season ahead, always managing the crisis that's right in front of him. never quite landing in a place long enough to pass the immediate need, and has been asked to do something different. To look further, to plan as if the ground is solid. As if it will hold, as if he's staying. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet and certain, and it settled into the room the same way everything about him, settled without drama, without performance, with the simple weight of a man who means what he says. "All right," she said. Ben came down at 6, as he always did, in stages, half asleep and navigating purely by instinct. He went to his chair. Then he stopped. He was looking at Hannah's hand on the table at the ring on it. He hadn't seen it yet. He came closer and picked up her hand with both of his small ones and looked at it very seriously, at the plain ring on the plain hand of a woman who had never worn anything plain that wasn't real. "Is that from Pa?" he said. Did it belong to someone before?" "His mother." Ben thought about this. "So it's old." "It's old. Does that make it better or worse?" She looked at him. "Better," she said. "Old things that last are always better." Ben considered this with the gravity of someone integrating new information into an existing framework. Then he put her hand down, carefully, back on the table, and went to get his breakfast. She watched him go. She looked at her hand, the ring, simple and worn and real, and she thought about what she'd told him. Old things that last. She thought about this ranch, which had lasted through drought and debt and grief and 3 years of one woman refusing to let it die. She thought about the fence lines that had been reset and would hold through the winter. She thought about the accounts that had been balanced, and the south herd that was going to come in above projection in the spring. She thought about 4 boys who had arrived in October with everything they owned in 2 canvas bags and had become, in 7 weeks, as woven into Silver Creek Ranch as the grass and the cold and the particular quality of the Montana sky. She thought about a placement bureau in Billings, and a clerk, and a misfiled letter, and a man in a Kansas boarding house who had read that letter and needed it to be true, and had ridden 3 states on test of it, and she thought, maybe that's what it means. Maybe that's what all of it means. That the things that last don't always come in the way you planned. Sometimes they come sideways, through someone else's mistake, on a train platform in October, with 4 children and a hat in their hands. Sometimes the life you were supposed to have is not the one that shows up. Sometimes what shows up is better. Sometimes it's exactly what you needed without knowing you were waiting. The morning came fully in around them, the boys coming down in their sequence, Luke and Owen and Wyatt and Ben, and the sounds of the hands starting up in the yard. And the fire high, and the coffee strong, and the kitchen full of the noise and warmth of people who've found their place and know it. Gideon reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned hers over and held on. Ben, from across the table, watched this with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world has been confirmed at its deepest level. Owen appeared in the sitting room doorway, looked at the tableau, said nothing, went back to his book. Wyatt came in from outside, smelled the biscuits, said something enthusiastic and incoherent, and sat down with the energy of a person for whom the world is perpetually interesting, and probably always will be. Luke came last. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at his father and Hannah, sitting side by side, hands together, morning light coming in from the east window, his brothers around the table and the sounds of the ranch coming through the walls. He stood there and looked at it for a long moment. Then he crossed to the table and sat down. He picked up his coffee. "Hannah," he said, testing the word the way he'd tested it against the counter that first night. Finding out once again what it weighed. "Luke," she said. He looked at his coffee. Something moved across his face, private and young and complete. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to, and she didn't need him to, because she knew. She knew exactly what the word cost him, and what giving it meant, and what he'd decided it was worth. Outside, Silver Creek Ranch went about its business in the Montana cold, cattle moving, fences holding, hands working the ground they knew, and inside, around a kitchen table that had been silent for 3 years, and would not be silent again. A family that had found each other through a clerk's mistake and a wrong letter, and 2 people stubborn enough to tell the truth built its first ordinary morning together. It was not perfect. It would not always be easy. There would be hard winters ahead and difficult springs, and the thousand ordinary emergencies of a working ranch and a family that was still learning the shape of itself. There would be days when grief surfaced in unexpected places, and days when the weight of it all pressed harder than expected, and days when patience ran short, and nobody said quite the right thing. But there would also be mornings exactly like this one. Coffee on the table, biscuits in the pan, Ben's drawings on the windowsill 8 now, 9 growing by the week. Luke's steadiness, Wyatt's irreducible, unstoppable aliveness. Gideon's hand over hers, this kitchen, this ranch. This family, built not by blood and not by design and not by a placement bureau in Billings, Montana, that had filed one letter in the wrong folder on an unremarkable afternoon in the autumn of 1887. Built by choice by two people who had every reasons to stay closed and chose instead to open, who had every excuse to protect what little they had left and chose instead to risk it, who looked at a wrong letter in a train station and 4 hungry children and decided that the mistake was not a mistake at all. Built by the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing, there is two people deciding, in the face of everything, to stay. Silver Creek Ranch was not just land anymore. It was not just fences and cattle and winter accounts and spring projections. It was not just a place where people worked. It was home chosen, earned, and permanent, and it would hold.